好，让他回不来，你们回来吧，回走吧，回走。哎，回走，回走。
We're spending the month of June in the village of Taoyuidao. In English, this means Big Fish Village. 5,500 people live here. The village has 263 boats, used for both coastal and deep-sea fishing. The province of Shantung is a quarter of the size of the state of Texas, and it has 64 million inhabitants. Its shores stretch for more than 1,000 miles. Shantung lies between northern and southern China. It is also the birthplace of Confucius. For 3 or 4 yuans a month, you can rent a house. You can buy one for 800 yuans, which is about the average annual salary. The village hostel, where we lived, has several rooms opening onto a courtyard. It is reserved for travelers, free of charge. The men and women of the militia keep their weapons at home. We tend to think of China as a huge expanse of land, forgetting that it has over 10,000 miles of seacoast. For more than 100 years, foreign invaders came to China by sea. In 1899, Shantung province was invaded and it rebelled. This was the first anti-colonialist insurrection, the Boxer Rebellion. The major countries of Europe, as well as Japan and the United States, formed a military expedition to crush the rebellion. Peking was burned, and more than 1 million lives were lost. Today, this sea belongs to a free people, liberated in their work and in their struggles.
Okay, so then after that is going to be Smart Club, and the thing there is we're going 3 places. We actually have someone in Kosovo, someone in Catalonia, and a nice fella in Scotland who has an amazing accent. You can drive the truck right through.
Hey, can we have another extra link? Your son is quite noisy.
Look, this is not Pod Save America. We, in fact, don't have any subscribers, and we have received 1 donation of £5. So until you discover the money tree, this show will not be able to afford multiple Zoom accounts. And I want to be absolutely clear on that, okay? Until we have the Pod Save money, you will not have the Pod Save facilities.
La imagen por la cual vale la pena arriesgar la vida, sacrificarse hasta la muerte en los campos de batalla de todos los continentes del mundo.
Live from Berlin, it's the Committee Program, the chronicle of the world's most mysterious global political strategic entity. On today's show, Monday, May the 17th, we welcome Paul Mason, Salma Karmi-Ayyoub, Alejandro Aviña, Liz Castro, Bujar Aruqaj, Ben Jackson, Philip Proudfoot, and featuring committee's own Deputy Director Julia Doubleday and the rest of the committee gang. And now, a man who apparently needs an introduction again and again and again and again, the Director of Committee and our host, Arun Chaudhary.
Oh, thank you all so much. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm trying to be better at this. This is the Committee Program. I am your host, Arun Chaudhary. We hope you'll join us at fans.fm/committee and maybe even consider becoming a member, as every week we are trying to pump out the good stuff. And this week, actually, Jacopo was not a great week everywhere. Not meaning to bring down the mood too much, but I think we're especially thinking of our comrades in Palestine. And I think a lot of this show, what's important about it to me is maybe talking about, for people who don't have as much exposure to international politics for the first time, some of these things. And I just remember the first things that got me into different issues, and actually was thinking about it a lot today. And this book, there's a lot of them, but Joe Sacco, is a comic artist, makes graphic novels, and they're on nonfiction subjects. And he's done several on the Balkans and on situations in the Middle East, and his one on Palestine. This book was actually what I read before I went working there on a documentary, and which was my first time, certainly being in the occupied territories, and just the kind of human way he takes you through what are complicated situations and gets a lot of history and a lot of motion in there. You know what? Why are we doing this? Fiamma, we should figure out how to get a hold of Joe Sacco and have him on the show and talk about how these things are great ways.
Definitely call him.
So we should do that. But anyway, it's a really good show tonight, and we are going to be talking about Mexican revolutionaries, but not the originals, 1560s, agricultural. Then we'll be talking about nationalism, national liberation, self-determination. In the chat, we've been noticing a lot of people sort of getting in a rut of all nationalism is bad, and I kind of want to challenge that a bit. I want to interrogate that a bit. And then what else are we doing tonight? We are also then talking to, Northern Independence Party, Philip Proudfoot. That should be very interesting, and I think especially for you, because this is maybe an extension of the kind of digital-first campaigning that you and Ludovico are so famous for in Italy. But I digress. Let us go on to the show, and let's get set up for some cross-Atlantic crosstalk. Let's get it all up on the board.
Hey, so what's even a backslash mean? I told you, you just have to say, what's the show about? Who are you? And how can they subscribe?
I thought it was a backslash. Is it a forward slash? Okay. Well, I'll do one. You tell me if it's okay. Thank you so much. You've been watching the committee program. Thanks so much. You've been watching the committee program with Arun Chaudhary. And if you want to subscribe, go to fans.fm/ I won't even say what it is, right? So I'll just be like fans.fm/committee. And there's lots of extra content that you can unlock. You might even get yourself a T-shirt. There's all kinds of things that you can do there. That'll be fine, right?
Yeah, that can work.
I think it might be a backslash, though. I think you should look that up. Hi, welcome to Cross Atlantic Crosstalk. With us, as always, the fixture of Cross Atlantic Crosstalk is our own Julia Doubleday, Deputy Director of Committee. And tonight we have a special guest. We have Paul Mason, who is my friend from the UK, who is a journalist, who is a filmmaker, and who has a book coming out. He just got the proofs, which is super exciting. How to Stop Fascism, which is just going to be exactly as it says. Paul, that's correct, right?
Yep.
And the last time I saw you, we were in the Midlands in the rain in 2019 trying to get out the vote for Jeremy Corbyn and Labour, and obviously having a disappointing result. And actually, before we get into anything else, I want to ask you about that area we were in. Like, you know, it seemed most of the people we talked to, obviously, we were targeted just to get out the vote. So we were speaking to people who were still committed, not people who said they wouldn't vote for that man.
Yeah.
But in these last set of elections, we saw, worse results in a lot of places than under Corbyn, which were to believe is some sort of, low watermark. Who were the voters who are leaving now then? Are these new or different people? And it's something I asked Ellie Mayo Hagan, and I want to hear what you say, though.
Okay, well, we're still doing the autopsy on the 6th of May local elections in Britain. They were local elections, so they are a low turnout. You're voting for the city government or the town government or the police commissioner or the mayor. And so they're not like for the election we campaigned in December 2019. But the short answer is the same people who were leaving Labour then are still leaving, in the sense of that they're neither coming back, and in a way their story, their narrative is hardening. For US listeners and viewers, it's exactly the same phenomenon as the Trump phenomenon, but without Trump. You've got older, white, I say working class, people above the age of 55, often owning their own homes. Those kind of people in small towns who, whether they know it or not, are racists. We're a colonialist country. They believe the greatness of this country lay in its empire. They're outraged at the fact that we tore down. I mean, you guys tear down statues of Nathan Bedford Forrest and other Klansmen. We tear down statues of 17th century slave traders. But they're outraged at this. And I was on British TV at prime time last night in a debate programme called Question Time. The audience is handpicked to be full of such voters. And what they say is, we're leaving you because you call us racists. And then they say, and then the next part of the sentence is always something racist. The people who are cheating in the election are Asian people, where the head of the family gets all the postal votes and votes. It's so... They are on a journey that they're not a majority, even of the Conservative voters. They're on a journey that involves Brexit, economic nationalism, xenophobia, racism, and above all now, anti-wokeness. In the British press and the British talk shows, everything is about woke and how terrible being woke is, and how terrible Black Lives Matter and Me Too and Extinction Rebellion, all of these things. So that's who's still leaving. The problem is, at the same time, we have a new phenomenon. We have, we have some great left-wing Labour MPs, almost like a sort of identikit miniature version of the US squad. And they're really interesting people. But that's not who's making the running now. Who's making the running in England is the Green Party. And our Green Party is not like your Green Party. It doesn't have sort of pro-Syrian, pro-Assad kind of I would regard as crazed positions on foreign policy. It's quite a genuine European-style Green Party, and it made really important gains in all the places where that other part, that core constituency for Labour already resides, which is the big, multi-ethnic, cosmopolitan, skilled worker cities. So Labourism is being squeezed, and that's what was the story. It's squeezed between populist right and between a resurgent Europeanist green left.
And I think that's a generalization that we can make for our audience who may be less familiar, is that in Europe, the sin of the Green parties is to lean too far into liberalism, not to lean too far into sort of fringism, as it is in the US. It's definitely a different thing. Julia, I mean, talking about the squad and our actual own squad, I mean, the thing, and I was talking about it with Nomiki on her show last night, the thing that's been interesting to me is seeing the American public, and I'm shifting to Palestine a little bit already, to see the American public shift in our relationship with Israel faster than our elected officials, including the squad. It's almost reminiscent of marijuana, you know? I think it's something to behold. I mean, you've been following this, I assume. Each of the squad, obviously, they have their own opinions and they're their own people, but, you know.
I think, you know, always change comes from the bottom up. So no matter who we have in office, they're always going to follow to some degree, like the current of what they generally think their supporters are saying. So we actually have seen over the last few days, I would say, a much stronger stance from AOC now in the last couple days after her supporters were kind of piling on her. You know, she has made some strong tweets condemning Israel and what's happening. And not in a both sidesy kind of way. And then obviously, Rashida Tlaib is Palestinian. She spoke on the House floor about being Palestinian and about needing to recognize this human rights crisis very movingly yesterday. So I think what we're seeing, though, with this sort of broader progressive movement toward being really vocal about the Palestinian human rights crisis is just something that's been building and building. It's been a long time coming. I mean, I think younger Jewish activists that I know, like over the last 10 years, have really become more and more engaged with, okay, well, I'm for human rights. I'm for Black Lives Matter. Like, what is actually going on the ground here? And really changing those positions. And you can see that reflected in the data, that it's really younger Jewish Americans have a much different viewpoint about Israel than older Jewish Americans. But I do think, you know, on the left, there's always been this reluctance of like engaging with this, not wanting to be harmful toward anyone. And now, you know, we're just at a breaking point, you know, seeing people just being slaughtered, basically, in Gaza. I think everyone is just sort of like, you know, we just can't be silent about this at this point. And so I do think it's just something that's been building over the last 10 years. And especially, I'll say one more thing, with social media. I mean, I think without social media, you know, I'm on Twitter now and I can just see bombs dropping on people's houses, and it's a recording that someone made with their kid in the background. You know, it's not CNN. You're not getting that filter anymore.
I think you're actually describing that one with the soldiers bursting into the house, which is absolutely like a terrifying
I'm not. There's
video.
So many of them.
Yeah.
There's so many.
And
it
is the difference between, I had the opportunity to be during one of the Israeli invasions of Gaza in 2003, to be there. I think it was 2003. I can't remember the exact year. And and like everyone else who actually visits, like visiting and seeing was the radicalizing experience for me. And I feel like everyone's able to actually get that now. Happening on phones. Paul, is there anything different this time? And I want to get tricky with politics here, so forgive me about that. But obviously, Labor just went through some would say, including myself as a Jewish person, very cynical attempt to smear the left wing of the party as anti-Semites. How does this play into people's reaction to what's happening on the ground in Palestine? Does this temper what would normally be a stronger reaction, or just what do you think?
Well, I mean, to start by saying, I was in Gaza in 2014 during the war, reported from the front line there, and my like you and like anybody who's been there, especially during a conflict period, the number one thing I want to say to before people start thinking how it triangulates into their politics, you know, what's happening with Labour, what's happening with AOC. This is a war. This is a production line for dead children. And at the end of it, when the Qasem rockets run out and when the Israelis get the nod from Biden, it will calm down. The war bit of it will calm down, and there'll be a bunch of dead children in makeshift graves. And I cannot, for me, in a way, that the experience of, you know, seeing blanketfuls of dead bodies of toddlers thrown in front of me in the hospital was de-radicalizing in a way. I am more of a pacifist now, and more of a cynic about the anti-imperialist claims of Hamas, certainly, and Islamic Jihad, than I was going into it. Having said that, to answer your question, okay, let's talk about the demographics. The British Jewish population is 300,000 people. It is largely professional. It's largely liberal and orthodox. There is an ultra-orthodox population in the city where I come from, Manchester, many of whom have arrived from France because of their flight from what they saw as a hostile environment there. So the salience of the British Jewish population is strong. It's there in the media, in politics, in public life, but it's not the same as in America, where it's a big thing. So we can't say like for like here. I would also say that the default position of British social democracy is always it's quite good. They are friends of Israel. They are friends of the Israeli Labour Party. They lament the politics of Netanyahu and Likud, and they support the two-state solution. And so the front bench Labour politicians have been coming out saying, condemning the bombing for definite, and certainly condemning the mobs of far right people who are beating people up. So that's the overall picture. It hasn't really, we haven't really got a kind of blow up inside the left yet about this.
I mean, I guess that's good, because we do need some solidarity, especially because you do mention the Israeli Labour Party, which is frankly like barely a thing at this point. And I think when we talk about trying to do international solidarity, the fact that the left in Israel has had such a hard time being coherent, even as they have had success, across their immediate border with some of their Palestinian comrades in ways that I think are extremely exciting. Yeah. I mean, I would say, Julia, the emergence of these younger groups, Bend the Arc, Not in My Name, these sort of U.S. progressive-led groups are extremely young, and it does show a new generation of leadership in the U.S. I mean, these almost all led by folks in their 20s. Because I don't know if you read the J Street response, but that's sort of, again, people moving faster. Like, they seem to still, I don't know how to say it without sort of coming off the wrong way, but people still seem to feel the need to check the boxes before they say the thing about what they think is wrong about the war, as Paul very rightfully calls it, that's unfolding. I mean, is it just a generational thing?
I mean, I think generation to generation, it's obviously not just this one issue where the younger people are a lot more progressive. I think that there's a variety of reasons for that. One is just that for the baby boomers, they lived in this sort of reality where they were able to buy houses and go to school and not be in this lifetime of debt, and all of these sort of things that for baby boomer Americans, have kind of gone away for younger people. And that in and of itself is a bit, radicalizing. It's sort of making people say, okay, well, I don't know about this system because it doesn't seem to be working even for people who are relatively, okay in the world. And I think more broadly, like internationally, again, I think social media is playing into this, not having all of our news coming through one sort of mouthpiece, or one, in the US there's like 6 media conglomerates that own everything. So I think, just being able to have that kind of debate, I know that a lot of times journalists are like really afraid of that. They don't like it. They're like, everything needs to go through a fact checker. I can understand that. Like, obviously we've seen this big surge in conspiracy theories online. But at the same time, we have to know that, we look at things like the Iraq War, these institutions aren't serving us. They're not serving the public. People have a right to want to be able to communicate with each other and also to push back on things. I mean, one thing that is, I would say, constant in like the New York Times editorial page is that they just keep writing editorials that are like, someone was mean to me online and they called me a dumbass, and like, this is so mean. And it's just like, okay, like, this is the new reality. If you say dumb shit, like someone's going to call you a dumbass, and that's okay. That's, you know, that's part of our new freedom of being able to communicate on a much broader scale, you know, with anyone around the world. So I do think communication is important, and being able to communicate with people all over the world is a big reason that people are beginning to see more flaws in a system, where if you only listen to media, you would think like, well, things are getting better for everyone everywhere and everything's great. Like capitalism, it works.
Yeah. Sorry if my screen coming on and off was distracting. I've actually shifted cameras. And look, Julia, until we get that pod save money, we know we can't have that pod save quality. This is the problem. I do want to ask you, Paul, when we're looking at Biden just authorized Trump's, like, you know, sale of arms to the UAE, to all these other places. Like, when it comes to any of these changes in foreign policy on a grand scale, is public pressure enough, or are people going to do what they do because they do it? This is obviously, you know, a circus you've seen go on for some time.
I think public pressure matters. What you've been talking about there in the sea change inside the Jewish community in America is one thing very important for the Democrats. Here, I'd say, I mean, tomorrow we're going to have there was already a big pro-Palestinian demo. There's going to be a big one tomorrow. And what matters there is the British Muslim community, because our Muslim communities are heavily concentrated in working class cities. They are the mainstay of the Labour vote in all of those cities. There are many now Muslim MPs in the Labour Party, and it's Eid al-Fitr. You know, it's a big thing. It's going. It's what is happening is being felt really strongly inside Britain. Now, I know because of my political contacts that the Johnson government is not very strong. It's not gung-ho pro-Israeli. This might seem a weird thing, but Johnson himself is he has a Turkish background, you know, Turkish ancestry, but it's not that. He kind of likes the perfidious Albion, we call it, the idea of playing one former colonial power against another. He's got a lot of time for Erdogan, a lot of time for Turkey, and I was hearing from within Johnson's administration noises about the sort of ethnic cleansing aspect of what's going on inside cities like Lod, inside Jaffa. What's been happening, because I think there are two conflicts here, aren't there? The conflict that started it is the ethnic cleansing of East Jerusalem, that's then sparked the problem of right-wing Israeli mobs bringing forward that horrible sort of terrible thinking that is coming out of there. You know, in 2014 when I was there, it was only thinking and a few demos. Now it's action. Now we've got windows being smashed. Now the British Conservatives are looking at that and saying, we don't have any leverage over this. Biden may think he does. We don't have any leverage, but we're sure as hell going to take the rap if a crime against humanity were to happen. Also, they understand, you know, that a crime against, this is my big fear, a crime against humanity is entirely possible if the IDF goes en masse into Gaza. Not because it has low standards of professionalism or is out of control, let's be clear, but because there are elements within the IDF that, you know, senior unit commanders who've become politicized towards that agenda of the Likud, the Naftali Bennett type politics. And the Brits look at that and they go, hold on a minute. They just signed a semi-secret arms and military trade deal in December 2020 with the Israelis. And it doesn't look very clever now. The British Parliament voted to recognise the Palestinian state 2 years ago, but the government hasn't enacted it. So they have things they can do. My call is on them to do those things, to pull the arms agreement. You know, it's not the same as BDS, but it's a suspension of the agreement until the danger of being complicit in a crime is over, and then all the things they could do to restrain Netanyahu. Well, this is what I think the US Democratic Party and the mass movements need to do with Biden. and Blinken, they need to explain that you're going to end up complicit in something historically bad. Because I think that's what, I don't know about you, Aaron, but this is what everybody who goes there and experiences it comes away with. I am more worried about what's going on.
Yeah, you don't want any part of this.
No,
yeah.
I'm more worried right now. Horrible though the Gaza war is, I'm more worried about the political dynamic inside Israel. In terms of danger to life, long-term danger to life. Yes, of course, I think now, I don't know what the death toll is right now this afternoon. The way the Israelis work in Gaza is they do precision strikes, and they do warn people to get out of buildings they're going to collapse. Of course, those people can't take their livelihoods, their family photos, their stuff.
The destruction of the homes is the point.
Yeah. The point, however, the child deaths and the civilian deaths, as well as any fighters who've been hit, are done, in my experience, because they wantonly target key fighters or commanders that they have identified and discount the families as collateral damage. That's where, I mean, you'll get blast injuries, you'll get all sorts of injuries of war. I mean, it's the callousness. When I was there, let me tell you, I don't know if you've got time for this. When I was there, I was in a place called Jabalia, which was a big refugee camp, and it's massive now. It's like a shanty town. And we got a leaflet dropped on our head saying, but from an F-16, saying, please don't go to North Jabalia, leave North Jabalia and go to South Jabalia. Well, while we were reading it, some people from South Jabalia came in carrying their dead son, who'd just been hit by a rocket on his motorbike in the market. Because motorbikes are how Hamas move around. So he got hit. He wasn't in Hamas. He was just a guy. And so I phoned the IDF press office and I said, right, you tell me where North Jabalia starts and where South Jabalia starts, because we're moving. I just want to know where to move to not be bombed to smithereens. And of course, on the other end of the line, who is it? It's an American intern, a young girl, probably not out of college. She doesn't know where South or North Jabalia is and doesn't care. And what that teaches you is that, yes, it's a professional-looking army, but it has, in my experience, an utterly callous regard for human life. That's what we're seeing. Let's be concrete about it. It can be stopped. Biden could pick up the phone. F-16s use American ammunition. The Israelis ran out in 2014, and they had to be resupplied by the Obama administration. Just by not resupplying them, you're basically cutting off their ability to do this stuff. And I think that should be the demand. We have a concreteness to the demand. In other words, rather than think it's unwinnable, I think the progressives and the left could win something here and force Biden and Blinken to do something.
I think that's a major point, like what's winnable. I think that's also speaks to what Julia is saying. It's like there's actually political objectives that can be achieved. They should be, looked at, and it's not this intractable forever thing. But Julia, isn't there, we're talking about the politics, talking about this changing, isn't there a fundamental difference in the way that we talk about this in public and private? Everyone, no one really thinks a two-state solution would work, and yet every single person is signed on to wanting a two-state solution.
Well, I think
The
movement has moved away from a two-state solution recently in the U.S. I mean, mostly what I've seen recently is the one-state solution, the idea of it just being a democratic state and everyone integrating into that state. I think the issues with the two-state solution obviously are, the same sort of issues we're having now, which is just, the Palestinians confined to very small areas and probably continuing to be attacked in the same way that they're being attacked now. So, I mean, I do think there are multiple different threads of the left that have advocated for different ideas. At the end of the day, though, I do agree with Paul that the thing we have to be talking about right now is just getting that aid cut off if, we're participating in this sort of genocidal terror campaigns, which is something that I think all of the left is pretty much in agreement about, we're funding this, we're giving them military aid, we're supporting it. And obviously without this sort of like just broad hall pass from the American government that's like, do what you got to do, we're still going to have your back. There wouldn't be this sense that, Netanyahu can just act however he wants and there's not going to be any consequences globally.
Salma is going to be 10 minutes late, so I'm actually going to change gears and we'll ask her. I will do one round of questions with her when she comes in on Palestine. But Paul, let me just change gears real quick and ask you. So, I mean, we're hearing about EU citizens being kicked out of the UK. This seems like one of the worst ways to put your best Brexit foot forward so soon after the ink is drying. I mean, what's going on, so people know?
It's not a major story. It's major in its moral decrepitude. But what happened is that when Britain left the European Union and the transition period ended, then the freedom of movement between Britain and the rest of Europe ended. So now we, the Brits, have to join the foreign queue, the same as you, as we enter Europe and vice versa. Now, there still is quite a tolerant and an open regime for European citizens who are already living and working here. There's 3 million of them. But what's happened to the people who got caught in a trap was that a European citizen is supposed to have the right to come, say, on holiday or on a journey to the UK to look for work. If they get work, they have to go home, apply for the job, and get a visa. What's been happening, because parallel to that, there's a very tough, border regime for everybody else, for brown people, let's put it clear, frankly. There's a tough regime at the border, which is like a zero tolerance. You just don't get in. It's impossible to come in and claim asylum, as is, for example, happening on the southern border of the United States. That's just physically impossible and politically impossible. So what happened is that these largely female young workers were arriving from Spain and elsewhere in Europe that were on trips to try and come and get jobs, and for some reason we just can't understand, they got treated like brown people. I mean, they literally got jailed and locked up for 48 hours in a refugee detention centre with COVID. I mean, so it's like I think this is in a weird parallel to what I was talking about with the IDF. It's the callousness and indifference of these huge bureaucratic systems to people. In terms of how it plays into the current situation, there's another big thing just happened, which is very good and exciting. Yesterday in Scotland, our equivalent of Homeland Security went in to deport 2 Indian guys, again on Eid, it's a holiday. So they go in and they put them in a van, and remarkably, the whole neighbourhood, which is, I'm glad to say, were the classic people straight out of the woke SJW stereotype of the right, mums with green hair, grannies with green hair, people from every race and colour, turned up. I mean, like 1,000 of them turned up, sat around the van, sat under the van, and after several hours, the police had to go in, rescue their own people, and let the 2 guys go. Now, why is it important? The place it happened was the constituency of the Scottish First Minister, the Prime Minister of Scotland. And she is a progressive Scottish nationalist, Nicola Sturgeon, pro-European Union, pro-migration. And the order came from the Tory government in London to send these guys in. So it's a major victory. I would just say, linking these 2 things, we have to remember that now there is a progressive alliance of voters, not just in the United States, which delivered the Biden victory. We potentially have it here in the UK that could deliver that victory. The problem is it's split between several parties, and we're going to see it again in France next year. The politics is polarized towards values. The old political machines don't get it, but the elderly conservative racist vote is not strong enough anywhere to govern if the progressives can get their act together.
Yeah. When last we spoke, I think it was after, some big victories in Emilia-Romagna, Tuscany, and other places in Italy, which of course is the bellwether where it's so important to be testing those things out. But I think France is just a great example of how it's hard when there's three different people trying to park in the same parking space. So, you had a summit, you had a thing I think we all dream about, especially in Europe, which was the progressives having a summit. You had Yannick, you had Eric Piolle, you had, I think, Anne Hidalgo, the socialist mayor of Paris. I think Mélenchon was not there, but he was definitely invited.
Mélenchon's never there. He's never
No, I mean, that's not his thing. That's not his thing. But, they had an agreement that lasted 3 hours before it fell apart. That they would have a primary together. Yeah, exactly. And what was impressive about it was the fact that it actually lasted 3 hours.
Look, I'm talking about something much bigger. My book, which comes out later this year, How to Stop Fascism, it argues very simply just one thing. Hannah Arendt described fascism, and we're dealing here with a proto-fascism in the Republican right. There's no doubt about it. Marjorie Taylor Greene, Boebert, and all the rest of them.
Yeah.
Arendt says fascism is an alliance of the elite and the mob. In the 1930s, the experience of the Popular Front in France and Spain, the only two places where fascism was really held for a while, was a political alliance of the centre and the left, called the Popular Front. I think the Biden victory was that. There was no Republican middle. The Lincoln Project had no base.
Absolutely, I agree.
What you had was an overt alliance of the Bidenite working class, with socially conservative and all the rest of it, with the left of the Dems and the Green voters and minorities, Black Lives Matter. That worked. We just need to recreate something like that. I think we're going to have to do it as the French did in 1936, from the top and from the bottom, through base organisations and through agreements. That's what I'm essentially working on here right now. I think we can make it happen, but it means that tribal bureaucracies of parties have to just get real. We're playing for we're playing for the kind of unrepeatable world championship between progressive politics and an alliance of far right and right wing populist crazies. They aren't going away. We just have to keep defeating them until the energy of that movement dissipates.
I mean, defeating and delivering, and that's where it becomes a problem, right? Because if people aren't going to deliver. Yeah,
right. I think exactly what Arun is saying is just that I think in the long term, in order to build that coalition that's going to draw enough people to, have this successful movement, we do have to advance, our political goals. And, a great example, obviously, is climate change. It's one of those things where we're trying to meet in the middle, but if we meet in the middle too much, then there's no planet. Like with climate change, it's not like, hey, you want to stop using fossil fuels in 100 years and we want to stop using them now. So let's stop in 50 years and then we'll still all be dead. There's certain things that if we don't push for those things and we don't demand those things, and withholding votes or withholding alliances are unfortunately sometimes the only way people have to wield power, I think. I've always voted for the Democrats. Actually, that's not true, but I usually vote for the Democrats. But I do understand why sometimes people withhold their support or their vote. I would say, likely the victory of Trump in the last election is probably why Biden is more cautious and more progressive now. If Hillary Clinton would have won in 2016, I think she would have had a far more right-wing foreign policy actually Biden's foreign policy is very right-wing, but she would have been more
on that also.
Yeah, she would have been more right-wing
similar noise
on climate and everything else. So, it's just trying to strike that balance of we want to win. How do we win without upholding this very in the long-term oppressive status quo that unfortunately I think is just going to fuel fascism.
We're also asking a lot of our squads, right? Because to do what you're saying effectively, and Paul, I'm saying squads, and I'm
squads,
UK squads as well, is that it's like the point at where the workers walk off, right? The threat of the strike isn't the same thing as the strike. So it's like the point at which you actually withhold your vote on something that matters to the leadership of the party is the point at which, number one, they try to destroy you. And we see labor being very effective at eating their young, especially. But number two, it's the point at which, the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. Like, I think we see, I think especially we see folks on the American left go up to that line, but not totally, especially face Nancy Pelosi down.
Yeah, I mean, the political dynamics are different. And remember, here in Europe, while we are facing the same problem of a resurgent far right and a conservatism that is split between wanting to go far right or to actually, in some cases, to absolutely in a principled way resist. That's what we're facing. The basis from which we are starting is in many cases stronger. I think the American Constitution has opened the United States to the danger of being the state most susceptible to fascism, because it doesn't allow you to do what this 1930s German-American jurist Karl Lowenstein said. His famous phrase was militant democracy. Most of Europe, by 36, 37, had laws banning uniformed fascist militias, except for the fascist countries. They had laws banning militarized marches. Germany today has a law drawn up by this guy which bans fascism. Fascism still exists, but there is the legal duty to suppress it to the government. Now, these laws are impossible to enact under the US Constitution. And I think that therefore one has to... I'd be much happier playing a tactical game against Emmanuel Macron or trying to think, well, can we get a red-green alliance in Berlin rather than a green-yellow-black alliance, whatever the colours are. We can play those games. But in the United States, I think there's only two games. The two games are Tom Cotton, Trump, and all the other crazies. On the one side, probably Ivanka Trump, probably Jared Kushner. That's a possibility. The second Trump victory, or the left learns how to do what the Europeans did in the 30s. That is, you use the relatively moderate alliance government to create space for struggle. And it's interesting that I think summer is coming in the Northern Hemisphere. I'm quite interested in what the communities that have resisted, both here in the United States, do in summer. What do they do? And how do those leaderships then react?
Yeah, I mean, I think also, what you're talking about with this sort of moving the moderates and trying to ally with the moderates, like, I do think AOC is somewhat representative of that. I mean, I think she's getting a lot of pushback by some on the left right now because she's being so appealing to moderates, but I don't think she's doing that while really selling out leftism. I think that she's doing a good job of threading that needle of being like, I still believe all these things, and also I'm appealing to like wine moms in the suburbs, and that's kind of what we need. At the same time, I don't think it's bad to criticize AOC. Obviously some people are crazy, but if you're going to, point out that she's not being as progressive on Israel-Palestine, and then she gets so much pushback that she, sort of publicly changes her position or is more public about whatever private position she held, that's a good thing. So I think you need both. You need like the push and pull of like, we're pulling the moderates in and we're also continuing to push our leaders to be representative of the future that we want. I mean, there's also just the additional dimension that I think really doesn't get talked about enough, which is that we're so anti-democratic in so many ways. So like from gerrymandering to voter suppression, these awful voter suppression laws that the Republicans are pushing through, the primaries that we have that like nobody knows about, the fact that we don't have universal voter registration from the day that you turn 18, which we could easily do. Some of these things are in the PRO Act, which would be great to get passed. But in terms of what the country actually wants and like the consensus that's there, it's almost like if you look at the polling, we don't really need to win over more people. We need more people to vote, and we need more representation. And right now we don't have that representation.
That's right. That's right. We had a wide-ranging conversation, but we are out of time, and we will have to catch up with Salma Karmi-Ayyoub at a later time and hear more about what's happening on the ground in Palestine and the elections, which I think it'll be interesting to sort of see how that is playing into, not to be crassly political about it, and as Paul Riley points out, this is an actual battlefield, but there is a political element to it. It is about who provides services when people are desperate, and I do think that that is something that it's hard to take seriously unless you've been, again, to Gaza or seen footage of what it is to be that trapped. But yeah, thank you all for coming on, and we will talk again soon. And thanks for watching.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Bye.
And we do have now joining us, and we are grateful to have Salma Karmi-Ayyoub with us, who is a British-Palestinian lawyer who works in Palestinian human rights. Thank you so much for coming on the committee program.
Thanks for having me.
So we wanted to hear a bit about what you've been hearing as someone who is in the UK but has worked on Palestinian human rights, about what's unfolding now in Palestine, and just, illuminate folks on maybe the very specific origins of what happened. What started this fire that we see on television?
Okay, well, I think it's important to understand that there's a kind of a broad context for what's happening, and there's a more immediate context. So the broad context is that for decades, Palestinians have been living under Israeli rule and have been subjected to policies of severe racial discrimination amounting to apartheid, and to policies of settler colonialism and ethnic cleansing. So everywhere in Palestine, Palestinians are affected by policies such as having their land taken away from them, having their homes demolished, having their residencies revoked, and living under conditions of occupation in the West Bank and Gaza which are really close to unbearable. Now you have a more immediate situation in East Jerusalem. So East Jerusalem is part of the West Bank, and it was occupied by Israel in 1967, and it is originally a Palestinian city. It was 1967. It was almost fully inhabited by Palestinian Arabs. Since 1967, Israel has pursued a policy of what it calls Judaization of the city, and that's not my term. That's the term of the Israeli government, in which it strives to ensure that there is a demographic, what it calls ratio, within the whole of Jerusalem of 70% Jewish people to 30% Palestinians. And that's recently been modified to 60% Jews, 40% Palestinians. And it does so it has to create and maintain what's ultimately an artificial majority of Jewish residents of Jerusalem through appropriating Palestinian land, demolishing Palestinian homes so that their life in the city becomes untenable and they have to leave, and revoking their residencies. And you have increasing numbers of right-wing Jewish settler organizations that have open designs on the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the holy part of Jerusalem. It's a mosque which is the third holiest site for Muslims, and it's also the site of the Wailing Wall, which is important in Judaism. That's in the Old City. So you have settler organizations that have designs on the Al-Aqsa Mosque. They want to demolish it and replace it with a Jewish temple. You have all of these policies apace to essentially Judaize the city by removing Palestinians and replacing them with Israeli Jewish settlers. In the last couple of weeks, matters have come to a head because there is a particular part of East Jerusalem called Sheikh Jarrah, which has, for decades, right-wing settler groups have been trying to evict Palestinians from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah and take those homes over and build settler units in their place. A court decision was recently issued by an Israeli court, allowing the settlers the right to evict the Palestinians from their homes. And so that is the immediate cause of this recent increase in tensions. There have been protests. Palestinians and their supporters have been protesting against the evictions in Sheikh Jarrah. At the same time, it's been Ramadan, and I think the Israeli army and Israeli police deliberately escalated tensions by storming into the Al-Aqsa Mosque last Friday and using not live ammunition, but rubber-coated bullets and stun grenades against what they called protesters, but they were people actually praying inside the mosque, and that was a sort of unprecedented move of the Israeli forces to actually storm the mosque in that way. And so you had a kind of perfect storm. So you have all of these tensions that have been raging for decades in Jerusalem, but in particular the Sheikh Jarrah evictions and then the storming of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And that is what led to the most recent sort of escalations and everything we've seen since that time.
And, again, we are political on this show, so forgive me when I go back to politics. But do you feel like the stoking of, if what you say is an unprecedentedly provocative act from a prime minister, perhaps, who is unprecedentedly provocative, specifically in this way when he is in political trouble, which, as we know, he has sort of generally been in for now what seems like ever, how do you think that plays in?
Look, I think there are a number of factors at work. So I think Netanyahu himself, who's facing potential proceedings against him personally for corruption and the like, is looking absolutely for a diversion to divert attention from his own problems. However, I wouldn't say that's the only thing that's going on here. I mean, Israel has a tendency every few years to provoke Palestinians, especially around the issue of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which they know is incredibly sensitive. It's incredibly important to Palestinians everywhere. And in so doing, I think they usually, the motivation for doing that, so they carry out some kind of provocation, storming the Al-Aqsa Mosque, closing down prayers unnecessarily, closing down the Damascus Gate, which is one of the entrances to the old city that they also did just before storming the Al-Aqsa Mosque. They'll carry out a provocation like that, I think, at a time when they want to stoke tensions. They stoke a Palestinian reaction in order to have a pretext to ram through a particularly right-wing or sort of territorially maximalist policy, be it creating a new settlement, be it evicting Palestinians from somewhere which has long been disputed, be it providing cover for essentially some of the most right-wing ultra-nationalist policies which this Israeli government has been pursuing for years. And I think also the fact that we have this provocation at this time is kind of an indication of a broader context, which is that ever since really the breakdown of the last kind of negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians, Israel doesn't really have a plan B. It has a plan A, and plan A is keep appropriating Palestinian land, keep building Israeli Jewish settlements, contain and neutralize the Palestinians as much as possible, and that's it. There's no plan B. There's no sense that they will ever make any concessions, that they will give up land, that they will allow for there to be a Palestinian state. It's just kind of perpetual occupation, perpetual colonization, grab as much as they can. And so they need these confrontations in order to provide cover for them to continue to pursue that policy, which, like I said, doesn't really allow for any form of compromise or concession to the Palestinians.
Julie, I'd love to open it up to you while we take advantage of Salma being here.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, one of the things we've been talking about before you got here was just sort of what the American left, as well as like the global progressive community, can kind of do to be in solidarity with the Palestinians. We talked about putting pressure on the Biden administration to halt aid to Israel. But I guess from your perspective, what are the things that we should be organizing for in the short term, and what are the things we should be organizing for in the long term? Because I know, there are a lot of different ideas about what the solutions here can be, but I think, in the short term as Americans, we sort of feel like the biggest thing we can do is to try to stop sending so much military aid to the IDF. But I'd be interested for your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think, there is a real sense amongst Palestinians and amongst, I think, anybody who looks at this issue soberly, that one of the reasons that atrocities can continue to be committed by Israel on the scale that they are is due to Israeli impunity and lack of accountability on the one hand, and on the other hand due to the support, the political, diplomatic, financial, military support that Israel acquires from the West, and principally from the United States. And so, Palestinians really are advocating for those on the outside who wish to be supportive, to put pressure on their own governments to stop lending this aid and support to Israel. And I think that could be a kind of both a short-term and a long-term strategy. I mean, it's something to call for in the short term if there's an immediate, tranche of aid or something which is going to be sent to Israel. There's an immediate call for the US and other governments to withhold that and use that leverage in order to get Israel to scale back on its actions. But in the longer run, there's a need for, I think, foreign policy towards Israel to be reformulated so that instead of it being viewed as a strategic ally of the West, which should be supported to the hilt and protected from any of the consequences of its actions, there needs to be a kind of reformulation of policy in which Israel is understood to be what it is. To be perfectly honest, at the moment it's a settler colonial state engaged in an ongoing policy of ethnic cleansing of an indigenous population and all of that entails. And it needs to be stopped from doing that and encouraged to change its policies to become a truly democratic state, a state of all its citizens, a state that accords equal rights to all of those that it controls. So that would be the longer term objective, would be a kind of reformulation of foreign policy vis-a-vis Israel. I'd say the other side of that is a question of accountability and impunity. So the International Criminal Court has recently opened an investigation into Israeli war crimes, and the United States is not currently a member of the court, although it helped to found and shape the court. Many European governments are member states. Many European states are member states of the ICC. So I think there also needs to be a call on Western governments to support the International Criminal Court in its investigation. And if we get to a point where there is a trial at the ICC, that those efforts should also be supported rather than hampered. So I would say those are the main areas I think that people could focus on.
Thank you so much, Salma, Karmi-Ayyoub. Thanks for coming on, and maybe we can catch up with you sometime soon. And as we hope, tensions ease, but also with practical, progressive progress.
Change
measures.
Yeah,
Progress.
you saw I was trying to land the plane, and then I had nowhere to go, and then that's what came out. Thank you, Salma.
Thank you.
No,
yes, thank you.
Committee, comitato, committed, committeto,
Welcome to your Global News Rodeo. Our roundup as done by Forrest Lovette. Thank you, Forrest. Item 1, Israeli apartheid. Rockets rain down in Gaza. Al Jazeera reports at least 119 Palestinians have been killed, including 31 children, in attacks carried out by the Israeli military. Hundreds of families are taking shelter in schools facilitated by the United Nations. Israel continues its atrocious air raids in the Gaza Strip. A prosecutor from the International Criminal Court told Reuters the individuals involved in the conflict will be targeted in investigations of alleged war crimes. Süddeutsche Zeitung says Human Rights Watch has accused Israel of the crime of apartheid in dealing with Palestinians in their occupied territories. I think it's a word that we need to use. Item 2, back to the laboratory. Labour Party scrambles after election woes. That was a good one. I like that, Forrest. Reuters reports that UK's Labour Party, Keir Starmer, has reshuffled the inner structure of the party following embarrassing losses in last week's local election. We've been talking about this. A few changes were the replacement of the head of economic policy and Angela Rayner, the party chair and campaign coordinator. More infighting ensued as many officials knocked the removal of Rayner. Labour seeks to find itself after the continual decline in the polls. They have now lost 4 consecutive general elections dating back to 2010. And I also just want to say, disingenuously, many people have talked about something called Long Corbyn, which is like somehow Jeremy Corbyn's effect is still pulling the party down. I want to reiterate what our last 2 guests from our last 2 weeks have said, which is that Jeremy Corbyn overperformed both before and after him in a lot of these important red wall districts in the north of England. Okay, that's it. Item 3, Guerre Civile. French soldiers threaten civil war. The Guardian reports a second open letter from French military leaders has surfaced. The first letter was addressed to President Emmanuel Macron's government and accused them of cowardice, deceit, and perversion. Both letters appeared in the right-wing publication Valeurs Actuelles. The second letter said in closing, once again, civil war is brewing in France, and you know it perfectly well. There are claims that over 76,000 people have signed the attached petition. I do just want to draw a parallel to a letter that some military folks are signing in defense of Trump's accusations on the election. So, I mean, maybe some military folks will sign anything? I don't know. Item 4, no chair for Cheney. Liz Cheney ousted by her own party. Last Wednesday, House Republicans voted to remove Representative Liz Cheney, who is, of course, related to former Vice President Dick Cheney, not a great guy, from her leadership position of conference chair. NPR reports the movement to oust Cheney comes after her continued criticism of former President Donald Trump and his lies of election fraud and his role in the Capitol insurrection last January. Cheney was already considered to be one of the most conservative members of Congress, but there is clearly a new yardstick in the Republican Party which asks, how low can one go? The Wyoming Congresswoman's position has been quickly filled by Trump loyalist Rep. Elise Stefanik of New York, who's exactly the kind of person the Republican Party wants to be putting forward. But I just want to be super clear, Liz Cheney is not welcome in the resistance. Item 5. Human Rights Watch. Sierra Leone seeks to abolish capital punishment. African News reports the government of Sierra Leone will submit to their parliament the abolition of the death penalty. Although the last executions in the country were carried out in 1998, the death penalty has never been officially abolished, despite criticism by human rights advocates. The EU ambassador to Sierra Leone, Tom Venn, said on his Twitter, "We will continue our partnership with you to promote progressive human rights agenda in support of the country's current president, Julius Maada Bio." And finally, item 6, the Great Fall. Chinese rocket falls into the ocean. Scientific American is reporting that debris from a Chinese rocket crashed down in the Indian Ocean last Saturday. The out-of-control 20-ton booster re-entered Earth's atmosphere above the Arabian Peninsula and finally splashed down north of the Maldives. The Maldives. Come on, man. This isn't the first incident of uncontrolled debris falling from the skies. Last year, another Chinese booster crashed off the coast of West Africa. New NASA chief Bill Nelson, oh yeah, I forgot they made him the NASA chief, responded to the incident saying spacefaring nations must minimize the risk to people and property on Earth of reentries of space objects and maximize transparency regarding those operations. So Bill Nelson is a former astronaut and the former senator from Florida. And very funny story, I met him on the Obama campaign in 2008, and he said, "Hey, it's nice to meet you. I've never met like a videographer, whatever he said before." And I said, "It's nice to meet you. I've never met anyone who went into space before." And he looked at me and he went, "Really?" And I was like, "Yeah, man. Like, what? Come on." Anyway, that tickled me at the time.
Coming up, a look at your local radar. But first, the current local conditions. Your local 36-hour forecast from the National Weather Service. Your local 36-hour forecast from the National Weather Service.
Forrest, I think the pun work, as far as it goes, is very nice. It's very funny. I am still trying to, look, it's about data visualization. It's about communication. These are the things it's about. Look, I have now, a lot of our comments have been like, Arun should have headphones, I think it's going to help with the sound maybe. So I have underneath the hair, I have the secret thing now. So if you ever want to, I think, whisper images to me instead of numbers for things, it would be easier. Like the Chinese booster rocket, maybe we make a graphic that's just rockets, and then you tell me the numbers, but we just show the rockets. See, it's data, it's visualization. It's visualizing what the data is.
Yeah.
Welcome back. We are now doing our segment Deep Cuts, and today we have something very special that will be introduced by the show's own Julia Doubleday.
Thank you, Arun. So joining us now, we have Alex Aviña, Associate Professor of History at Arizona State University and an expert in Mexican politics. He is currently working on a book about state terror and drug wars in 1970s Mexico and how state violence against poor communities has fueled horrific levels of violence across the country for decades. But today we'll be discussing his previous book, Specters of Revolution, Peasant Guerrillas in the Cold War Mexican Countryside, and exploring the history of radicalism, Marxism, and community organizing in the Mexican countryside. In particular, his book focuses on the far southern coastal state of Guerrero and two activist teachers turned radicals, Genaro Vasquez and Lucio Cabañas, during the 1960s and early 1970s. Vasquez was killed in a car accident in 1972, but it is rumored he survived the wreck and was murdered by the state after being captured. Cabañas was killed in a firefight with the repressive PRI regime in 1974. Both men were buried in unmarked graves in an attempt to suppress the memory of their insurgent movements. So Alex is here to tell us a little bit about how it is that these two rural teachers went from community organizers and reformists to guerrillas demanding the overthrow of the government, and about the historical context of these movements. So Alex, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's awesome to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. So first we wanted to ask you a little bit about going back a little bit in time about the Mexican Revolution and the Constitution of 1917. So what promises were made to the public as part of the revolution and as part of the process of writing this Constitution? And how did the years that followed represent a betrayal of the promises of the revolution to the peasant population?
Yeah, so starting with the 1910 Mexican Revolution is extremely important, right? It's the first great social peasant revolution of the 20th century. It's probably the one that globally gets the least amount of attention in contrast to some of the other more famous ones like the 1917 Russian Revolution or Cuba or what have you. But this revolution that breaks out in 1910 is primarily fueled by the demand of either expropriated lands that were taken away from peasant communities and the demand for local democracy or local patriarchal democracy as it unfolds on the ground. We have a military conflict that lasts roughly from 1910 to 1920. There's different phases involved in this. Generally, for a long time, historians marked February of 1917 as like the end of the revolution because that's when you had the promulgation of the Mexican Constitution in 1917 that in some form still exists today, even though it's gone through a lot of reforms in the more than 100 years since it was promulgated. But that document that becomes law in 1917 essentially in a way codified the peasant demands that led to the outbreak of revolution in the first place, right? That demand of land that had been expropriated, plundered, taken away in the previous 3 decades prior to the Mexican Revolution, and the demand for something that they refer to as local democracy or municipal democracy, this idea of sovereignty at the very local level for peasant communities in a country that in 1917 was still overwhelmingly rural. And it codified them into, which at that point was probably the most radical constitution, at least in the Western Hemisphere, right? It wasn't just about enshrining political rights, political democratic rights, but it was also about enshrining social rights as well, right? The right to land, the right to housing, the right to form labor unions. So it was a radical document on paper. To actually get these things into practice took decades and decades of struggle And even then, the promises of the Mexican Revolution for many communities, like the communities in the state that I focus on in this book, in Guerrero, those promises remained either unfulfilled or partially fulfilled. And when folks would organize and demand the actual application of Mexican constitutional rights, by the 1950s and 60s, the Mexican state under the PRI, the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, this political party that was in control of Mexico from 1929 to 2000, they increasingly would respond to these popular peasant demands with increasing levels of violence, right? And this also takes place within the context of the Cold War. So that gave them a certain anti-communist discourse that the state could then use against any sort of popular movement whose demands were really demands that were articulated within the confines of the Mexican Constitution, not, some sort of Soviet Union or Cuban revolutionary inspired demands. So these movements that emerged in the state of Guerrero in the 50s and 60s, they tended to be multi-class. They incorporated peasant communities, impoverished communities. They had even, civil sector, civil workers. And you started to see the emergence of these big multi-class civic movements start to emerge in the late 1950s in response to both local, really hated political bosses and state governors that tended to rule with an iron fist. But then they slowly radicalized to take on, to form a more radical critique of the entire PRI and Mexican state structure.
Right. I want to, before we even get into the 50s, I also wanted to touch on the 1930s. You talk a little bit in the book about how a lot of the radicals that end up being, guerrilla fighters and major activists and people who think the government should be overthrown, they start out as reformists and they say, we still believe in the Constitution, we still believe in the president. And a lot of times you refer to them as Cardenistas, so they are supportive of the former president Cardenas, who served in the 1930s, as an example of someone that they feel like did live up to the promises of the revolution. So can you tell us a little bit about, who President Cardenas was, what he was doing, and then maybe from there, what happened to the PRI, because he also was a member of the PRI.
And I think also if you can examine just that thread of who the characters were in the original Mexican Revolution who were close to the presidents and promising these things, I think we've kind of missed some of the wholesome moments.
Yeah, no, those are great questions. So, I mean, there's an assortment of local radical figures that were involved in the Mexican Revolution in the state of Guerrero who I think are really fascinating. And because they're not national figures, they're not well known outside of the state. So, for instance, you have a guy who ran for the mayorship of the city of Acapulco in the late 1910s, who became known as the Lenin of Acapulco. This guy by the name of Juan Escudero, who before running to be mayor and then successfully winning the election, managed to organize longshoremen, longshore workers, and fisher folk and peasant communities on the outskirts of Acapulco into this radical social democratic movement that was really inspired by the most radical vector of the Mexican Revolution, and that's the figure of Emiliano Zapata in the southern state of Morelos, right? This idea of Emiliano Zapata and the original Zapatistas during the Mexican Revolution, the idea of peasant power going from the community up, right? So it was a form of people's power or popular power, locally defined, protected by an armed populace, that then managed to spread throughout different countries of Mexico. And essentially what they were demanding was peasant control over land. Not just the actual ownership of land, but also the right and the ability to determine the social, political, and cultural uses of that land. And so Zapata becomes the most radical figure of the Mexican Revolution. He inspires a series of different movements throughout the country during the military phase of the revolution, and even after, right? So the guy that I mentioned in Guerrero in 1919, Juan Escudero, the Lenin of Acapulco, we will be in power from 1919 to 1923, during which he's assassinated in 23 during a counter-revolutionary coup that takes place in the country. But it's this idea of Zapata that really takes hold in certain parts of Guerrero that motivates people like Escudero. And again, the simple idea is the people who work the land should own the land and should be able to determine the social and economic uses of that land. And that then will shape how political power develops, right? It's developing from the ground up as opposed to a centralized state form based in Mexico City that's dictating down to peasant communities. Well, that's what ends up, that latter version that I just described is what ends up winning out. By the time we get to the 1930s, you have the election in 1934 of President Lázaro Cárdenas, who's I think most historians would say he's probably the best Mexican president of the 20th century. He's remembered as actually implementing some of the radical precepts that were enshrined in the 1917 Constitution. He's known for nationalizing Mexican petroleum, and he's also known for redistributing millions of hectares of land to different peasant communities. That's the positive, and that's how he's remembered by many peasant communities to this day in a place like Guerrero. The negative aspect that historians have kind of uncovered and thought about is that he also laid the seeds for this single-party authoritarian political rule that would then dominate Mexican politics until the year 2000. What happens to this single political party ruling structure when you don't have a progressive leftist president like Lázaro Cárdenas? What happens when it's hijacked or taken over by more right-wing conservative figures, which is what will end up happening after 1940 when Lázaro Cárdenas leaves office. But Cárdenas is still remembered and becomes a referent in peasant political cultures for what the Mexican Revolution could be if it was actually implemented, and it didn't just remain, on a piece of paper that's referred to as a 1917 Constitution.
If it wasn't permanent in its revolutionary institutionalism. Sorry, Julie, go ahead.
No, well, so I was just going to say, I think, the bulk of the book takes place during the Cold War, and it seems like a lot of the people that end up being radical, he's sort of the reference point to make the case that, like, look, we're not communists, we're not traitors, we want to actually just embody what the Constitution promised us. But then over time, they continue to get radicalized. So, basically by the state being overly repressive and murdering civilians. And over time, they're like, okay, well, none of these outlets that supposedly exist, like organizing and electoral politics, those outlets aren't actually real in terms of being able to challenge the PRI. And they turn to guerrilla warfare. But I did want to talk about sort of one of the sparks that kind of ignites this flame in the countryside, which is this movement against Governor Caballero. Could you tell us a little bit about this guy in 1960, like what started to happen and who were the people that kind of came together specifically just around this one very corrupt governor?
Yeah, so he was Raúl Caballero Aburto was a military general, originally from the state of Guerrero, from a part of Guerrero called La Costa Chica, the small coast south of Acapulco. He had been a longtime military man. He had been assigned to military attaché positions abroad. He allegedly was involved in the brutal repression of opposition dissident political figures during the 1952 political campaign. So he already had this kind of like nefarious legacy of putting down popular protest. And through this really obscure backroom dealing type of way, the PRI posits him as the candidate to be the governor of Guerrero in the late 1950s. They go through the performance of these elections, right? It's not that they just appoint him and put him into office. There's actually these elections where you have the PRI running candidates and you have an assortment of smaller political parties, some of whom are actually being financed by the PRI. It's this whole show. So Caballero Aburto takes over in the late 1950s, and what he starts to do is he starts to rule in a very violent, nepotistic way, right? He puts his relatives in really posh government positions and posts that allow them to be extremely corrupt. He starts to implement regressive tax raises on the poorest working class communities and peasant communities of Guerrero. And he's also known for creating more police forces that will be used to tamp down on any sort of dissidents. I mean, there's an intrepid Acapulco-based journalist who starts talking about 1,000 people had been killed during the governorship, the 3-year period of governorship that Caballero Aburto was in power from 57 till 60. He was such a nefarious figure that he almost single-handedly sparked this statewide multi-class civic movement that includes, it's multi-class, it's multiracial, they organize in the countryside and in Guerrero cities. And their main demand is the ouster of this guy from power because he was such a violent, despotic, nepotistic governor. Under the Mexican Constitution, the Senate actually has the ability to remove governors. And so the goal of this movement was to occupy public spaces in 1959, 1960, and force the Mexican Congress to pay heed and to remove this guy from power. In that movement, you started to see the emergence of really young, charismatic reform movement leaders, one of which was Genaro Vázquez, one of the main characters of my book, the guy who ended up being one of the guerrilla leaders. He had been an urban school teacher. He had studied in Mexico City at the National School Teacher Training School, where he had been trained by Spanish Republican exiles. So it's a cool link between like the Spanish Civil War and the type of activism that he will embrace. And then you had another young, charismatic student from the Guerreros Teacher Training School based in Ayotzinapa, and this was Lucio Cabañas, this other school teacher who will eventually become the other guerrilla leader that I focus on in this book. And they actually worked together in this movement that eventually by early 1961 manages to get the federal Congress to oust this governor, but only after there'd been a massacre of protesters at the end of 1960 in the capital city of Guerrero. Something like between 20 to 30 people massacred by a military unit that had been sent in to kind of tamp down on the popular protests.
Right, yeah, when I was reading about him, it just seemed like there was already a lot of corruption, but he just took it to this level where it was like nobody, it was just way beyond what anyone else was doing. I was actually sort of laughing about when you were talking about how he put all of his relatives in power, because it was like his daughter, his son, his wife, his cousin, his other cousin, his other cousin. Like it was all of the positions were basically being taken over by this one family, and as you said, ruling with an iron fist. But one thing I thought was interesting was after they successfully oust this governor, that coalition that came together to get him out sort of starts to fracture a little, because some people, they just didn't like the governor and now they're like, okay, I'm kind of done. And Vázquez, in the meantime, he has this organization, the ACG, and they start trying to turn that into an actual oppositional political party. And so can you tell us about what happened in the next election when they tried to challenge the PRI through, official electoral politics?
Yeah, you're exactly right the way you lay it out. I think the PRI, throughout the duration of its rule, had a pretty impressive capacity to co-opt even dissidents and resistors. And that's what happened right after this 1960 movement. The ACG emerges during the movement against this governor. But as soon as he's removed and an interim governor is appointed, certain important leaders of this opposition movement get picked off by the PRI. They essentially sell out. So a really prominent student leader, certain politicians as well. And the ACG splits between one smaller sector that wants to continue to work with the PRI and this other sector led by Genaro Vázquez that essentially will eventually turn into a opposition political party that will run candidates in the 1962 state elections. And the message that they're carrying to every corner of the state of Guerrero is the message really of the 1917 Mexican Constitution. They're asking for things that are not beyond the scope of what Mexicans were legally entitled to constitutionally. What they were offering was a pretty pointed critique of what the PRI had become, right? That as the betrayers, the language that we use is, the PRI has become the party of the rich and the oligarchs, and they've betrayed the Mexican Constitution. We are trying to redeem it. Even though some members like Genaro Vázquez, you could see that their political radicalization had started to move a certain direction, right? And obviously, in the background, in the hemispheric background, is the Cuban Revolution, which did play an impact in not just Guerrero and Mexico, but throughout Latin America and obviously the U.S. So they start to run candidates in the 1962 state elections. They ran a candidate for the governorship as well. This man who was a highly respected Zapatista veteran, they had a really a barnstorming campaign, and they were harassed. They suffered persecution. They suffered assassinations, and they lost. And they lost these elections. They claimed that the PRI had done one of their other well-honed taxes, which was electoral fraud. And when they gathered to protest at the end of 1962 in the city of Iguala, we have another massacre. And once Vázquez barely escapes with his life. He has to go on the run. He goes to northern Mexico to escape some of the heat, even though there will be an arrest warrant put on him. But this really marks a moment of no return for people like Vázquez, and later on people like Lucio Cabañas, to think about how this system is not working, and even if we try to work within the system, the only thing that we're gonna result in is us being killed at the hands of PRI agents, whether it's the police or the military. And Vasquez has this quote in 1963 when he says, these bourgeois elections are a sham, they're a joke, they're a trick, and really echoes a really famous quote by Karl Marx on in the way that he talks about elections. So that marks, it's one massacre after another. There's also less well-known massacres that take place in peasant communities out in the middle of nowhere that also start to radicalize certain sectors of this movement. The movement, but for all intents and purposes, starts to splinter and divide, but this popular political radicalization continues to characterize much of the state, particularly when the people who come into power after this massacre essentially try to tamp down on more political dissidents in really harsh, violent ways.
And like squeezing Jell-O, usually that kind of repressive tactic just ends up making a big mess.
Yeah, I mean, they passed a law in 1965 that essentially made it illegal in the state to criticize the governor, the government, right? I mean, so you could see that a certain type of political authoritarianism was becoming more manifest. It had characterized PRI rule for a couple of decades, but now it was having a very direct impact in the everyday lives of people, of organizations, of unions, of peasant groups who were trying to organize. And now they were suffering the wrath of the state, whether in the form of the military or police forces wielded by different governors.
So then as we're moving into the late 60s, early 70s, let's just talk a little bit about what happens to Vasquez? What happens, how does he goes to the mountains, he starts organizing people into this guerrilla operation. How does that work? What is their methodology? How are they speaking to peasants? And what's the kind of conflict between the different facets of the left during that time?
Yeah, so eventually Vasquez, he lives on the run. And for the book, or for the dissertation that then became the book, I had the opportunity to interview his widow, and she told, they had kids, and she talked to me about how difficult it was to raise these kids by herself because Vasquez was continuously on the run. And he would drop into their Mexico City house once in a while, but then he had to immediately go because there was an arrest warrant for him, and he was identified by Mexican political police as a quote unquote dangerous agitator. Eventually, he does get picked up in 1966, if I remember correctly. He's taken to a jail where he's suffering death threats, assassination attempts. But he's such a good organizer that he manages to organize the prisoners. And then these prisoners start to demand things like better living conditions, better food. He's a great organizer. And his comrades, in these earlier movements, they're free. They also had continued to organize different independent peasant unions, different independent political unions, using their connections with these prior movements to grow something. By 1966, 67, and then eventually 1968, they had the idea that they were going to form a guerrilla movement that would seek the overthrow of the PRI. And he organized a small guerrilla commando that actually liberated him from prison in April of 1968. They escaped up into the mountains. And from the next 4 years, 68 to 1972, Genaro Vasquez and a small group of guerrilla fighters were up in the mountains trying to create an armed revolutionary movement against the Mexican state. By and large, they weren't very successful militarily. They were able to create urban cells that would, they would call expropriating banks, right? They would rob banks and then send money to the guys up in the mountains. But by and large, this movement didn't become a big one. They were constantly on the run, harassed by military units. Their biggest actions, really national actions that gained them a lot of notoriety in the early 70s, they would kidnap famous, wealthy people from the state of Guerrero, hold them for ransom, and then use that money to try to organize. But this movement militarily did not go beyond just a small group of people up in the mountains. The other guy, Lucio Cabañas, who was a member of the Mexican Communist Party, he took a different route. He ended up working as a local school teacher in the mid-1960s. He created so many problems for local political bosses and landed elites in Guerrero that they essentially exiled him to northern Mexico to work as a teacher there. He created so many problems there, organizing people to, protect natural resources, that they send him back to Guerrero. Like, we can't handle this guy. You guys keep him. And he gets embroiled in a local school conflict where the parents were fighting with a really horrible school rector who was demanding a lot of things from these really impoverished families. And at one of these rallies, they try to assassinate him in 1967, May of 1967. And from then on out, he goes up into the mountains in Guerrero, like many generations of Guerrero rebels before him had done, including some of his great uncles who had been part of Zapata's forces in Guerrero during the Mexican Revolution. And from 1968 to 1974, he's up in the mountains organizing a guerrilla force that at the low end probably included something like 140 combatants. And then, depending on some of the declassified military documents that I looked at or political police documents, the estimates could go up to as high as 250 to 300. And what distinguishes his movement, which was called the Party of the Poor, is that they did manage to organize and to create this broad network of communal support in the mountains and the coast of Guerrero. And they became infamous for ambushing, laying these ambushes for military convoys as the Mexican PRI, as the PRI started to send in more and more military into the state in the early 70s as a way to try to exterminate, launch a counterinsurgency and try to, in their words, in their documents, annihilate this guerrilla movement that had the broad support of many communities and cities in Guerrero.
It seems to me like there's two, and tell me if this is way off, but, there is this dynamic coming out of the guerrilla movement, from the revolution and kind of a very good through line there. But when you're also describing this activity in the late 60s and 70s and kidnapping and some of the sort of expropriation and more low-level activity, it's also reminiscent of, leftists, the Red Army faction, certainly the folks blowing things up in Bologna around this same time, although maybe it's a little later. Can you just sort of give us the international kind of how they would have fit into the international constellation of leftist agitators as well as their indigenous homegrownness?
Yeah, and that's a great question. Thank you. And that was the difficulty for me writing this history was to accomplish what you just asked for, right? Like appreciating the long historical roots, the homegrown roots of rebellion in Guerrero, but then also thinking about the international context. The Cuban Revolution, it plays a huge role, right? Ernesto Che Guevara's ideas about the Foco strategy. Obviously, he's playing a role, even though people like Vasquez and Cabañas completely disavowed it. Cabañas had some ideas that sounded like they were Maoist ideas. He's also was a member of the Mexican Communist Party. So he had a certain reading of Marxism that was based by that party's tradition within Mexican politics, which actually disavowed armed struggle. Like they would say that they kicked him out of the party when he embraced armed struggle, direct action in armed struggle. The one thing I'll say, so they're also aware of what's going on in Vietnam. That has a huge impact as well, right? The people struggle in Vietnam against the United States. They also know what's going on in other parts of Latin America. By the time we get to 1972, 1973, there's probably about 38 guerrilla groups operating in Mexico, both rural and urban. And they know what's going on. They're conversant with some of these global revolutionary traditions that are of the left that are going on at the same time. The thing that distinguishes Mexico, though, is the PRI, while domestically they were extremely repressive and they sound like any other Latin American dictatorship, they weren't seen like that internationally. They were seen as a revolutionary regime, and they did a lot of things internationally to enhance that image, like accepting South American exiles fleeing military dictatorships. They would invite them to Mexico to take care of them, while domestically they're wiping out their own armed left. So these leftist movements in Mexico were extremely isolated. The PRI was really close to Cuba, right? Because Mexico was really the only country that maintained diplomatic relations with Cuba, with Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro did not mess with these armed leftist movements that occurred in Mexico. So these Mexican guerrilla movements, both the urban groups and the rural groups like the ones I study in this book, they're the most isolated in Latin America. And they received almost no help. There was one group that I'll mention because I think it's a fascinating story. There were this group started it was started by a group of Mexican students who were studying at the Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow. They see what in the late 60s, they see what's going on in Mexico. They saw the infamous student massacre of October 2nd, 1968, and they said, we have to do something. They go to all these different revolutionary embassies in Moscow asking these countries to train them as guerrilla fighters. And they're turned away, and the only embassy that accepted to take them in and to train them were the North Koreans. So the North Koreans actually trained about 150 Mexicans in the late 60s, early 70s, and then sent them back to Mexico to try to wage guerrilla warfare. Some of those individuals then found their way to Guerrero, and they helped train Lucio Cabañas' Party of the Poor in tactics like how to ambush military convoys. But to me, it's kind of interesting that it was only the North Koreans that said, "Yep, yeah, we'll take you in, and then we'll send you back, and you can, start your revolution in Mexico."
That is super interesting. I did want to, as we kind of wrap things up, make sure that we're connecting what happened in the 60s and 70s Cold War era with what's going on today. I mean, one thing you talk about during the Cold War is that there's this sort of, perception, just as you were saying, that the Mexican government is pretty well respected internationally. There's the so-called Mexican miracle of like 3 decades of economic growth between 1940 and 1970. They had this really high GDP growth, but none of that is sort of being translated into the countryside. So in terms of, how the overarching economic system, how capitalism is sort of reliant on these peasant communities to continue this really, really fast-paced growth. How is that, one, continued to this day, and how do we see people either engaging or not engaging with this history?
See, I think, so what my book really tries to show is that is the underbelly or the seamy underbelly to the so-called Mexican miracle, right? So on the one hand, you have economists saying, look, we averaged 6% GDP for 3 decades. That's an economic success story. What my book tries to show is the type of violence that type of industrialization, modernization requires, right? So to put it bluntly, Mexican communities like those in Guerrero, peasant communities like those in Guerrero that I research, they subsidize Mexican industrialization, modernization, urbanization during that period. So if you watch the movie Roma, right, these beautiful images of Mexico City in the 1970s, that was made possible by the type of violence that I describe in my book, in which these small peasant farmers are being squeezed by an assortment of different power players from the national level to local political bosses. The way that we can connect it to today is that, one of the responses of people in Guerrero and other states, like the state where my parents are from, Michoacan, they decided not to take up weapons and try to overthrow the Mexican government. That's kind of a drastic decision. They decided to immigrate to the United States, right? So immigration to the United States really ramps up. Mexican immigration to the United States really ramps up in the 1970s and almost serves as kind of like a safety valve, right? Like hundreds of thousands of Mexicans are going to the United States to work in the service sector of the American economy. That somehow lessens some of the pressure, domestic internal pressure in Mexico. Mexico also had this like crazy high birth rate during the 1970s, right? And if you read the newspapers, that's all they're talking about. The Mexican presidents talk about that. And then the Americans start talking about it because they're freaked out when they're seeing all these Mexicans are coming to the US. And it's honestly the same shit we hear today about the immigration debate. It's happening in the 1970s. The demand for Jimmy Carter to build a wall is so similar to what we heard, right, in the 2000s and during the Trump administration.
Right, yeah.
But essentially...
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I always thought that was so bizarre, like with the U.S. perception of Trump. Like, we really like to attribute a lot of things to just, like, he's a total aberration from the rest of U.S. foreign policy. But if you go back, like, talking about building the wall has been a thing for, he turned it into a catchier slogan, but it's, 20, 30 years, 40 years. Republicans, Democrats, everybody's talking
John
about building
McCain
a fence.
ran on that every time he ran.
Constructing a barrier is
finish
what,
the dang fence. He used to
the
call it a fence,
nicer
but
term.
Yeah, no different.
Yeah, barrier fence.
The first demand for a wall happened because of the Mexican Revolution of 1910. And because the Americans were afraid that the revolutionary conflict would spill over into the United States, particularly on the U.S.-Texas border. So the first calls for the wall emerged in the context of the 1910 Mexican Revolution. And then, like, in the 70s, there was a congressman from New York who, the way that he talked about the U.S.-Mexico border is that he said this was our Maginot Line. He's like, and we all know how that worked out for the French, right? So, like, yeah, this is the idea that Trump is some sort of an aberration. It fits really well into the political agendas of both the Democrats and, like, these never Trumpers, right? This idea, it allows them to maintain this like bullshit American exceptionalism. But if you go, just go into the New York Times and put in border wall or border patrol from the 1920s on, it's the same discourse, right? And you really see that ramped up in the 70s. In this moment of intense social, economic, and political strife in Mexico, hundreds of thousands of Mexicans, eventually millions, will choose to leave and try to immigrate to the United States without papers. And that's, that's my family's a part of that. That's what my family did my parents did in the late 70s.
Well, we may. Go ahead. I was just going to say we may have to have you back on to have another conversation and get into NAFTA and all of these things that happened in the 80s and 90s. But I did, before we go, the last thing we wanted to talk about was just the new book you have coming out. So the premise of that book and what you're working on now.
It's eventually going to come out someday. So I'm researching. So one of the things we didn't talk about, and I actually didn't cover it as much in this book, and I will in my current project, is the Mexican state's response to these guerrilla movements in Guerrero and how they launched what activists today refer to as a dirty war. The disappearance of at least 900 to 1,000 people, Guerrerenses, people in Guerrero, as part of this really brutal counterinsurgency that Mexican military launched as a way to remove popular support, particularly for Lucio Cabañas' group, the Party of the Poor. So this, at the same time that there's a massive, quote unquote, war on drugs that the Mexican government is launching throughout Mexico, but also especially in the state of Guerrero, because there's a lot of marijuana and opium poppies that are being produced. So like the 1970s in Guerrero is this messy constellation. It's like layer upon layer of conflict. There's a war on drugs, there's a brutal, dirty war, there's guerrillas fighting, and that's what my second work is going to be about. I'm trying to figure out, and it's really motivated by the story of what's happened in Mexico since 2006, when we have low estimate, 80,000 people disappeared, more than 300,000 people dead as a consequence of this new drug war on drugs. Like I'm going back to the 70s to understand how that's really the origin point for the type of like industrial-sized violence that we've seen in the country since 2006, when President Felipe Calderón unleashed the Mexican military and launched what he referred to as a war against drug cartels. And right after my book came out, it was published summer of 2014. In September of 2014, we had this horrific thing that happens in Ayotzinapa, in which 43 mostly indigenous Mexican male students who were training to be teachers were disappeared, right? And we still don't know. I mean, they've recovered DNA evidence for one or two of them, but we still don't know what happened to them. And it's the type of people who are most likely involved in disappearing these students from Ayotzinapa, these very politically engaged, passionate teachers in training. They're most likely the same forces that were involved in the type of violence that I think about, that I research in the 1970s, right? So in a way, Guerrero is one of these instances for me in which the past has never passed. And on the one hand, you have people who still don't know what happened to their loved one because he or she was disappeared by the Mexican military in the 1970s. And on the other hand, you still have the same people in power doing the same horrific things that then produces another radicalized generation of students from a place like Ayotzinapa. And when they try to resist, they suffer the same type of fate that people in the 1970s suffered. So if you go to Ayotzinapa today, they have murals to Lucio Cabañas, to Genaro Vázquez, but they're also suffering a similar type of state repression and terror as the people that they have painted in the form of murals in the walls of their school.
Well, we'll really look forward to reading that when it comes out, and we'll have to have you back on. But thanks so much for joining us, Alex. The book is Spectres of Revolution, and we hope you'll check out that book as well. And thanks for being with us here today, Alex.
Thank you so much. It's a lot of fun. Thank you. I appreciate it.
La imagen por la cual vale la pena arriesgar la vida, sacrificar.
We're at T's house. He is the new chairman of the village's revolutionary committee.
Like this, look. And this finger here. Like this. Then turn. Are you satisfied with 4 daughters? Don't you wish you had a boy too? At first I was disappointed. Later on, I understood men and women are equal. Did you go to school when you were young? Since I was born in the old society and my family was very poor, I couldn't go to school.
Quand avez-vous appris à lire et à écrire?
When did you learn to read and write?
因为我在部队呀，这个当兵10多年，在解放军这个
I learned in the People's Liberation Army.
我们要互相学习。
We all studied together.
军队领导
With the leader's help.
的帮助下，我才学。
Now I know how to read.
现在呢，我能看一半的书，也能这个。
Yes, now I can read and write.
Vous êtes président du comité révolutionnaire. Comment êtes-vous payé?
You're the chairman of the Revolutionary Committee. How are you paid?
我都跟回个军的这个，
I still work with the brigade.
这个我现在
Even though I'm in charge of the Revolutionary Committee.
也是啊，平
We're all equal. I earn points according to the work I do.
Est-ce que votre salaire est plus élevé que celui des pêcheurs?
Is your salary higher than the fishermen's?
我比一般的渔民工资不
No.
高，因为我的劳动啊，
Since I work a little less than the fishermen,
所以我的工分比一般的渔民呢稍微低。
I earn less than they do.
我们这个评工分
Twice a year we discuss the distribution of work points.
一个是年底评工分，
At the
一
beginning
个是年初评。
and at the end of the year.
但评工分呢是自
Each
保
person proposes his own salary, then everyone discusses
有的
it.
高别人呢，自己对自己。
Sometimes people ask for more than they deserve.
Est-ce que vous appliquez réellement la démocratie?
Do you
dans la
really
brigade?
practice democracy in the brigade?
因为我们大队呢，
In our brigade,
有时啊
the cadres must consult the people before making a decision.
需要我们呢研究
For
什么
instance,
问题啊
when a
都要
problem
经过
comes
评
up,
论的意见。我们年终啊
or a
这个
production
做个什么
schedule
计划
needs to be
做个什么
decided,
计划也好，都要经
the
过
cadres
评论
consult the workers.
总的呢都是从群众中来，再到群众中
They exchange opinions. The discussion goes from the workers and back to the workers many times.
才变成一个决议
Decisions made
大
unanimously
家才能很好的一个进行。
carry more weight.
Thanks so much for joining us again on the show, on the committee program with Arun Chaudhary, who is me. And now we're going to do another edition of Smart Club, and it's going to be about self-determination. And I've seen a lot of chatter when the word nationalism comes up in the chat. And I think this is sort of the crux of what we're talking about. So I hope everybody enjoys this segment, and I'm really looking forward to it. Self-determination. It's a term both simple and slippery. Woodrow Wilson and Comrade Lenin both began the 20th century by speaking about it. And by the end of that century, the words nationalism, self-determination, popular sovereignty, national liberation were all bandied about together as much a part of the anti-colonial project as of any reactionary nativist movement. In the 21st century, we have seen nationalism mainly used as a pejorative term to describe the phenomenon as exclusively bad and leading to evil, but that hardly seems fair as progressive nationalism seems once again to be on the rise to counter the new colonialism of neoliberalism. I could have probably also just said neocolonialism. With us to discuss self-determination in the 21st century are Ben Jackson, Associate Professor of Modern History at Oxford University and the author of The Case for Scottish Independence, A History of National Political Thought in Modern Scotland. And he's going to speak about the smooth democratic processes we have going on there. And then we are going to speak with Liz Castro, who's a writer and publisher and the founder of, how do you say the name of the platform? I want to make sure that I say it correctly.
I meant to give you the transliteration. It's Asheta.cat.
Asheta. And we will put a post to that. And it's a nonprofit platform promoting creation. And I hope we talk about that in a different capacity at some point in the future. And she's going to be talking about the mixed legality and protest efforts happening in Catalonia. We're making a spectrum here, as you'll see, is what I'm doing. And finally, Bujar Aruqaj, research associate and lecturer at the Institute of Sociology at the Free University of Berlin, and someone who I often turn to when I'm looking for answers on his native country of Kosovo, where, transparency alert, I work closely with the Vetvendoja movement, which actually means self-determination in Albanian, but I'm sure that will come up. So look, we don't have to look for trouble right from the beginning. We can look for things that are not controversial. And can we start just by talking about each of these places has a cultural and political history that passes muster as an independent nation? Can we just fill the listeners in? And let's start with Ben Jackson. You know, the United Kingdom is not an ancient project. Can you just talk about, just bring us a brief history up to the present?
Sure. Well, Scotland was an independent state until 1707, when it entered
a union of parliaments with England and Wales, and created the Kingdom of Britain. And from 1707, Scotland was an integrated part of the British political system, right through the kind of high water mark of industrialisation, all the kind of modernisation of the economy and society that took place in the 19th and 20th century. And during that period, there's always been a distinct Scottish culture, distinct institutions that have existed, and that was part of the justification for the union with England. Was that the idea was that this would be a kind of union that would protect the distinctiveness of Scottish society, rather than being a colonial exercise where Scotland as a culture would be forcibly integrated into England. And so pretty much that was a stable political settlement right through the 19th and 20th centuries, through the creation of the welfare state in the mid 20th century. But round about the late 20th century, round about the time you get the accession to power of Margaret Thatcher, you get the start of deindustrialisation, sort of rising levels of economic inequality. Round about that time, there's a kind of reassertion of Scottish political identity that seeks greater self-determination there. And initially that is expressed as a desire for a devolved parliament within the context of the United Kingdom, which eventually bears fruit when Labour come back into office after 1997 in the Scottish Parliament, which is kind of like a sort of, in the US, I guess, like a kind of state legislature of that sort of level of powers. And so that's a kind of major step forward for Scottish self-determination. But throughout this period, there's been a party in Scotland, the Scottish National Party, that has always advocated independence. And after that devolution takes place, the Scottish National Party gradually gathers more support and eventually takes office in the Scottish Parliament, takes over the executive command of the Scottish Parliament in 2007. And from that point onwards, they're advocating for independence and the complete separation of Scotland from the United Kingdom, which even at that point in 2007 has quite a low level of support. But by the time we get to 2014, when the Scottish National Party are able to hold a referendum on whether Scotland should be an independent nation, there is a big jump in support for independence. That referendum campaign dramatically increases the level of support for independence. It finishes with 55% in favour of staying in the UK and 45% in favour of independence. But that is a big jump compared to where the level of support used to be. And since that referendum, the Scottish National Party has been keen to have another referendum. And that's sort of where we are in Scottish politics at the moment, is this question of, should there be a second referendum? When should it happen? And we've just had a set of elections for the Scottish Parliament last week that resulted in a majority of members of the Scottish Parliament being elected who were in favour of a second referendum. That's the Scottish National Party and the Scottish Green Party, both of which are in favour of a referendum. And so now the stage is set for a big argument over the next few years about whether there should be another independence referendum.
And we'll dig into the two sides on there. But Liz, 1,000 years of Catalonian history. And yet, I think as we talked about before the referendum, it was probably something that most journalists who even cover Europe had never touched as an issue. Give us, and Ben really set you up there. Do as good a job in condensing history beautifully as he did.
He did an amazing job. Let's see if I can give you an idea of 1,000 years of Catalan history in 3 minutes or less. The legend says that Guillermo Guifré el Pelús put his hands in his blood as he was dying and put 4 fingers on his shield of blood, which are the 4 red stripes of the Catalan flag, around 988. So just to give you a kind of legendary view of the birth of Catalonia. But the truth is that Catalonia predates the Spanish state by about 500 years. And in fact, even when what we learned in grade school in the United States, Ferdinand marries Isabella. Isabella is Castile. She's the Queen of Castile. Ferdinand is the King of Aragon, which is a confederation of kingdoms of Aragon, of Catalonia, of Valencia, and of the Balearic Islands, Mallorca, Menorca, etc. And that whole confederacy is a Catalan-speaking territory. That Catalonia loses its privileges in a war in 1714. Excuse me, in 17. Doesn't even matter. In the early 18th century, on September 11th, it is 1714, and this is when Spain takes away Catalonia's constitution. It takes away its parliament. It takes away its representative government because Catalonia had backed the wrong king, basically, where the Spanish backed the Bourbons. At any rate. But Catalonia doesn't go away, even though it's in 1714 when Spain begins to say that Catalans are not allowed to speak Catalan. And the Catalan language is the basis for the Catalan culture, the language, the dance, the music, the food, all of the different pieces. The central piece of Catalan culture is the language. And the feeling about identity of Catalonia remains throughout these last 5 centuries, but they're always a piece of being different than the rest of Spain. And Spain wants to, as every imperialist power wants, to enclose Catalonia within it. Catalonia is a entrepreneuring, prosperous region that has always been very successful and wealthy indeed. The very first train that was built in all of Spain, including the colonies, was in between Barcelona and Mataró. It was a private venture. It wasn't a public thing. Anyway, so then I don't even know where there's so much to tell you in such a short amount of time. There's this dictatorship in the middle of the 20th century, and a big piece of that is also Catalonia wanting to be its own identity. Mm-hmm. That was brutally repressed by Franco for 40 years. You weren't allowed to speak the language. You weren't allowed to dance the dances. You weren't. So beating out Catalanism is a part of the quest for Spanish unity. The fact that Catalonia
I think we see very similar things in Italy, especially with the Italianization. Exactly. Even this sort of gross paper over way, we'll change your name a bit, this kind of thing. So,
and after Franco dies peacefully in his bed, there's this whole transition, and there's this idea within Catalans that now we have an opportunity for democracy, and so they vote pretty much in favor of the new constitution under Spanish democracy. And that works for about 40 years, but there's this chafing because Catalans want more autonomy. It's very similar to the Scottish situation in many ways, but Spain keeps pulling back. And so this kind of, it all comes to a head in 2010, and this is when there begins to be a really big independence movement. 1 million people in the streets every single year for 8 or 9 years. With people, with this movement gathering momentum and saying, we really want to be able to say what we want. We want to have a voice in the government. We don't want the Spanish judges to overturn the laws that are created in the Catalan parliament. And that this friction between autonomy and Spain holding back is what really pushes the Catalan independence movement, which continues up until October 1st, 2017, which is when we have this referendum, which Spain says is illegal, and Catalonia says this is the only way we have to express ourselves. And Spain eventually comes in on that day, on October 1st, and beats people, peaceful voters at the polls. And the people have their hands up in the air and say, we want to vote. This is an incredible democratic process. 2.5 million people get to vote that day, and still Spain says no referendum even happened.
Yeah, no, and that was beautifully done also. And I think, again, that's exactly when a lot of our audience will have entered the scene, seeing, especially on Twitter and YouTube, a lot of clips of things happening at polling places that didn't quite seem like Western Europe.
It was an incredible day because there were this very strong, peaceful, grassroots movement, people insisting on voting peacefully, and brutal police action by the Spanish against voters. I mean, it's just like the biggest contrast you could imagine. People trying to vote and then being beaten for it in Spain.
Bujar, switching over to Kosovo. I mean, y'all did it the old-fashioned way: national liberation through guerrilla and civil war. A lot of Americans will know about this because, of course, we came in on your side and bombed Serbia, and of course helped with the liberation. But can you talk to us about? Again, it all seems so clear-cut, right? There was even a military victory, and yet Kosovo still has a nebulous status in the world, is not recognized by folks, seemingly is blessed by the United States. Like, what exactly is the problem? What is the holdup? And how does it play into some of these issues that we're talking about?
All right. Well, I think I'm not going to go so far back in history. I can start maybe with
the Ottoman Empire. No, it's okay. It's okay.
With the Ottoman Empire, exactly. I can start with that. And I think that around the 16th century is when the Ottoman Empire invaded.
Oh, I was kidding, though. You don't have to. Yeah.
And I just want to connect it to nationalism, which is the topic today, because that was when the Battle of Kosovo happened, and which is very, very often wrongly assumed that only Serbs fought, and I guess this is the cornerstone of the Serb nationalism. And actually, in this battle, the people of the Balkans fought against the Ottoman Empire. So this is, I guess, where the whole story really starts with reference to Kosovo, and which has implications in so many ways to this day. Although this is something that happened in the 16th century. So this is what I wanted to say. But anyway, with the Ottoman Empire, then you have 5 centuries of Ottoman occupation, right? And so in the 19th century, you have a kind of gradual liberation of these countries in the Balkans, also because the Ottoman Empire is becoming weaker and weaker, right? And so in this time, actually, the Albania gained independence, but Kosovo was left out of this sort of territory, and it became part of the so-called First Yugoslavia. Okay, skipping forward to the Second Yugoslavia, Kosovo was also always marginalized, right? It was always the poorest region in Yugoslavia. There is certain statistics, for example, from the OECD and so on, when they look at the level of development of Yugoslavia, and they, for example, look at the level of development of Slovenia, and it's comparable to, let's say, the level of development of Spain at that time, right, in the 80s. And the level of development in Kosovo is comparable to a third world country, right? So there was a very big inequality in this regard, and it was in many ways also extractive and colonial, if you want, in this way, because a lot of the resources which were acquired de facto, a lot of coal and a lot of energy from Kosovo went de facto to the center and so on. In 1976, I think
that's how empire works.
Yeah. In 1976, I think if I'm right, I may be wrong by 1 or 2 years, is when Kosovo gains some sort of autonomy, and has the right finally to open universities, so Albanian-speaking universities for the first time in Kosovo, and so on and so on. And with the rise to power of Milosevic, this autonomy is actually taken away, and it's not only taken away, also a lot of people are sacked from their work. And so you have a lot of people who finally who lost their job.
And just to help out the audience, 90% of Kosovo is ethnic Albanian speaking, etc.
Yes,
is the number,
exactly.
Right?
So all these 90% or the vast majority of them lost the right to go to work and lost the right to education. So a lot of education was actually in this time done in private homes. So people would educate in private homes and so on and so on. And then you have, of course, the breakout of the war in Bosnia and in Croatia. And this is in this time Kosovo was actually doing a peaceful struggle, right? So it was a kind of pragmatic pacifism, what I like to call pragmatic pacifism. And then, of course, with the repression and so on, with this kind of 10 years of blank, which surprisingly nobody mentions. Everyone mentions just the war. Nobody mentions this kind of period which was before that. Then you had the sort of uprising and you had a struggle. And then the NATO intervened, right, headed by the United States mostly. And you had a sort of protectorate, an international protectorate, and you had a peacekeeping force. Until 2008, you still have a peacekeeping force, but the number is very, very much reduced. And in 2008, Kosovo declared independence. And so now getting to your question, finally, the reason why Kosovo is not recognized is because of alliances, and it's purely political. of course, that Serbia has been aligned for very long with Russia, and Russia will not recognize Kosovo for this very simple reason. This is one reason. Another reason is, for example, why Spain wouldn't recognize Kosovo, and that is because of Catalonia, or why Greece wouldn't recognize Kosovo, and this is because of Cyprus. And so you have this kind of very big problems because Kosovo, in a sense, is feared to set a precedent for these other nations or these other communities, which then want to claim the right for self-determination themselves. Now, is it legitimate to have self-determination? Yes, totally. Because the question actually that you have to ask here is, what would be the alternative to that? So what is the alternative to self-determination? Is it subjugation? Is it non-determination?
Right.
So this is the question. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think digging in, especially to some of those coalition issues are really important. But first, I actually want to ask Ben, because in both of these other cases, we're hearing so much about, it not being a political project, but as much a cultural project that people can point to. We are always hearing with Scottish independence, it does seem like a pragmatic answer to Thatcherism, to neoliberalism, to people who want kind of more social democracy, and they see really are. But is there also a cultural component? Do we see, like you see in Ireland, say, like, a lot of young people relearning old languages, etc., or is this really kind of a progressive political project that lives outside of that world?
Well, within the movement, within the people who've always advocated for independence, there's always been a cultural component that a lot of the sort of founders of the movement and the people who've carried it forward have been people who've been very interested in Scottish history, literature, and languages, Gaelic, and so on. But I think to their frustration, they always found it was very, very difficult to generate a popular political appeal in Scotland that would be sufficiently broad-ranging to win over enough votes to get them into office and to support independence. And so for that reason, they've tended to pivot away from making a pure cultural argument and making more of, as you say, a kind of socioeconomic argument, making a kind of social democratic argument. And I guess in part that's also because Scotland in the mid-late 20th century was quite a labourist political culture. It was a political culture that was dominated by heavy industry and then the decline of heavy industry, by trade unionism and by the Labour Party. And so in a way, nationalists have often sort of pivoted off of that to say, well, in a sense, the sort of nationalism of Scotland is the kind of Labour nationalism. And so that's how we have to kind of present it. And the sort of electoral project the Scottish nationalists always had was basically how to win lots of votes off of the Labour Party in Scotland, who were the dominant party up until the early 21st century. So in that sense, there's culture in the background, but the broad appeal and the pitch that the SNP are making at the moment is a socioeconomic one. It's saying, and a democratic one. It's saying that Scotland is a distinct political community that has distinct political preferences that need to be realised and can't be recognised because of the dominance of the Conservative Party in London.
It's like in the argument of representation, sort of more than liberation, I guess, in some ways that you could say that. Liz, can you break down? I think this is a communications question as much as a political question, but how the words sort of patriotism for Spain versus nationalism for Catalan, how are these two things flavored differently in the media talk around the independence movement, and how are they weaponized by both sides?
Sure. That's a really good question. When you talk about nationalism, we often think instantly of 1945 Germany. That's the image of nationalism as Nazi, ethnic cleansing, Holocaust, and in fact, nationalism is really it's a celebration of a diversity of cultures by highlighting each one. There are differences between Catalonia and Scotland and Kosovo and, you know, different parts of France and different parts of wherever the world, each place has this identity, which offers this incredible wealth to the world of nations. That's a wonderful thing. It's like the diversity in biology, and so for a huge country like Spain or like France or like the UK or the United States or Russia to say, no, you're being nationalist by wanting to speak Catalan or wanting to have your culture. You should really only speak Spanish. Is, you know, it's accusing the other people of what you were doing yourself.
Right.
In fact, Catalan nationalism is, I think, very much like Scottish nationalism. And I know less about Kosovo, but I assume it's very similar. It's a very welcoming country. We have had huge demonstrations in favor of welcoming refugees, in favor of equal rights for all various different groups, in favor of, being solidarity with other communities around the world. This is not an exclusive ethnic cleansing kind of thing. In fact, you don't have to be. One of the interesting things that I always find about Catalonia is that 70% of the people who live here are descendants of one or more parents that are from someplace else, and that is considered a positive thing. So where maybe Spain considers itself patriotic, they say Catalans are nationalists and that's exclusive, and it's not. The Catalan parliament only in the last elections has a new xenophobic party, and it's not a Catalan party, it's a Spanish party. There have been no Catalan xenophobic parties in the Catalan parliament ever until, that's just not one of the values.
And I want to build on that because, working in Kosovo, seeing other things around, it occurs to me, and Bujar, I'll give you first bite at this though, but that having sort of progressive nationalist or, whatever you want to call it, projects does actually blunt the growth of kind of right-wing populism, nativism. I was just struck when I first landed at the sort of folks who made up the rallies for Vetvendoja, the Self-Determination Party, and what they were asking for. And not to be totally, I was fresh off the plane, so I immediately jump into cliches, and I'm like, these don't look like people I would hang out with necessarily, and yet they're demanding things like more queer representation, some things like, actually sort of progressive things. Do you think in terms of, so two-part question, and it's tricky. One, do you think that telling these stories and infusing it does give people different paths to positive things to go through? And do you think the resistance to it also just comes from an inconvenience of what you were saying before, these global alliances that have been a certain way basically since the end of World War II, but certainly since certainly since the 1990s? And is this just, you don't fit into the story? Everybody who's an independent nation, stand up. Oh, you were too late. You sit down.
Yeah, well, I think that what you're touching upon is there needs to be distinction, right? Because nationalism, yes, does have a negative connotation because of historical facts, as you mentioned, and so on and so on. Yeah. But we need to make a distinction because nationalism does not, or the concept of nation is not always exclusionary, right? It's not always exclusionary towards minorities and so on and so on. So we can make a distinction between, let's say, ethnocentric nationalism, and we can make a distinction between civic nationalism. And so I think this is the later one, which Kosovo wanted to establish, a sort of civic nationalism. You can see it, or which the kind of foundational fathers of Kosovo wanted to establish in Kosovo, and you can see it in the map. You can see it in the flag. You can see it in the flag. You can see it in the anthem. You can see it in like how the laws are of representation are built, and so on and so on. And so there was never a question that Kosovo would be this sort of ethnocentric kind of nationalist state, which would only always belong to the Albanians and so on. But within that country, there should be also a kind of, it should be democratic, and democracy also involves the right of the majority, right, for self-determination, for representation, international representation, and so on and so on. And I think this is a kind of right which was denied to Kosovo for many years, and now we are like 22 years after the war, after the liberation of Kosovo, and Kosovo is still not part of, let's say, international organizations and so on and so on. And this is the kind of sentiment, or this is the kind of aspects which really fueled this sentiment of nationalism in Kosovo. And then you had growing demands, let's say, for unification with Albania, although I don't know how much popular that is actually within Kosovo. I would doubt that would pass, but that is my personal opinion. And this is what fuels actually this sort of nationalist sentiment. Now we have sometimes, we also were trying to avoid, in political terms, trying to avoid, let's say, this sort of Bosnia kind of effect in Kosovo, where you have, as you said, 90% of Albanians, but then you have, kind of minority which is blocking everything, and then you cannot pass anything in the parliament, and so on and so on. And this used to be very often the case. This used to be the case because of internal constraints, but mostly because of external constraints. So yeah, when you look at the question of, when you look at Kosovo, you have so many decision-making factors. You have you have the United States, for example, which is still kind of active in Kosovo. You have the European Union, which is split. So it is pretty much ambiguous, which I don't know, you cannot be neutral in a moving train, right? As someone said. So this is also creating many different problems. So I think what you're talking about is precisely this, why it fueled nationalist sentiment. With regard to Vetëvendosje, it is very interesting because they are not nationalist in a classic sense, as you said earlier, right? So they're left-leaning party. So they do not deny actually any sort of rights for minorities and so on, but they do empathize the rights of the majority.
Sorry, there's some noise going on behind me. No, but that absolutely makes sense. And Ben, I want to kick us back over to you, this question of international alliances. Wouldn't it just be easier? We have a world that functions in a certain way. So let me be that guy for a second, and I'm going to ask you an annoying question. So Scotland is independent. Doesn't this mean the end of the UK? Won't Wales, Cornwall? Where does this all end? A fractured universe that goes down to its smallest component. How can we justify this? How do you justify this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the argument, or one of the arguments against Scottish independence that would be made by advocates of the United Kingdom, which is to say, well, the United Kingdom can be a very positive force because it's a bringing together of these different nations that can work together, and yeah, I mean, there's a kind of question about does every nation need a state, or can you have these kind of multinational constructions? I mean, I think the sort of problem that the advocates of the United Kingdom have is that historically and in recent years, the United Kingdom has always been justified on the basis that it's a voluntary union. That's how it's been legitimated. Going back for years and years and years, British politicians have always said, if Scotland wants to vote for independence, it can have independence. And of course, they said that at a time when support for independence was very low. But nonetheless, the legitimation of the United Kingdom has always been, it is voluntary, it is democratic. And so that then means that they're in a difficult position when one constituent nation expresses the view that it wants to have a referendum or to reconsider the terms of affiliation to the United Kingdom. And so in a way, the kind of advocates of the United Kingdom are boxed in a bit by that rhetoric that they've always used. And it's it's different from Spain. It's a sort of different approach from the Spanish approach, because the UK approach has been to say, no, you can, if you want to, you can vote to go, and we'll even organise a referendum for you to do it in 2014. So it's a different kind of statecraft from the centre in London than you get in Madrid. But it does mean that they now face these kind of continued demands about, wanting another referendum. And at the moment, the problem they have is they're trying to resist having another referendum when they've said for many, many years that it's perfectly possible for this kind of democratic decision-making to take place because of the particular character of the United Kingdom as a voluntary union that brought together these nation states. Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, the mechanism should be baked into the cake there, if not anywhere. It's almost like the Constitution of Texas famously actually has an escape hatch in it. I do think that's interesting. And Liz, I'm just trying to remember what you said. We spoke yesterday, and you said to a similar question, sure, like everyone who actually feels this way should be able to demand it. And I think when you examine it, that there will be very few cases when looked at that it wouldn't make sense for a people who have so decided to do so. That is premised on the idea of maybe referendums, which aren't always everyone's favorite, democratic process. Can you just expand a little bit on, like, are referendums the only mechanism to sort of determine a people? We know that there's sort of a flawed form of direct democracy. Expand on that. Sorry, I pitched you a weird one, but there it is.
No, that's quite all right. Right. So, I mean, I think that the argument, if we let Catalonia be independent or we let Kosovo be independent, then everybody will want to. That's a straw man argument. Actually, not everybody wants to. Texas, like you say, has their escape clause, but when there was a movement to have Texan independence, I think there was about 100,000 people who signed the petition, and there's 45 million people in Texas. So, they don't really want to. I don't think California wants to either, despite perhaps reasons that they might want to. But it seems to me, so you said, what are the other methods for becoming a state? Well,
finding out consensus of the people. It's a tricky thing, right?
Well, consensus or legitimacy, because one of the tried and true methods of creating a state is having a war and killing people, and that's considered totally legitimate. Somehow, having a referendum is seen as less legitimate than that, and having a people's movement that organizes mass demonstrations and organizes a referendum that the state refuses to recognize, somehow that's not legitimate, but killing people is, which is something that doesn't really make sense to me. But the overall question about, can anybody have a state, or is self-determination, a fundamental right? I mean, I think that's obviously yes. In fact, it's part of the UN Charter that a nation that identifies as such because of its history, because of its language, because of its culture, simply because it wants to it wants to feel represented. It wants to feel like it has a voice about its own affairs. That's the basis of this. The basis of it is freedom and it's democracy, and it's saying we want to organize our society in such a way that makes sense to us. And nobody gets to say that you can't do that. There's no just because, Ferdinand and Isabel got married 500 years ago, somehow Catalans are forever part of Spain because they say so. That's not the way it works. The democracy must have the consent of the governed. And so when a nation comes together and says, we need to figure out how we're going to feel represented, they don't feel represented when the Spanish courts overturn law after law after law in the Catalan parliament, because Catalan society tends to be more progressive and more left-leaning than the Spanish one. And so this autonomy, which was supposed to be the solution here, and letting, in quotes, Catalonia have its own laws and then overturning them means that relationship is flawed and it doesn't work. So that's where Catalans say, okay, well, the autonomy doesn't work, so we need to look for better solutions to feeling this representation, to living in a democratic society where we get to decide how we make our laws. And Spain said no, you can't. Spain continues to say no to this day. And in fact, after the referendum that we insisted on having, and even though they beat us, and that they put all of our political leaders in jail and sent them into exile. I mean, that's not democracy in any shape or form. Peaceful civic leaders are in jail at this moment for holding a referendum in Catalonia that represents a majority opinion of the people here. 80% of the people believe that this conflict of ideas about who should govern this country, believe that it should be solved by referendum. So referendums may not be ideal, but they're better than war. And they're a democratic way of listening to people. What I would prefer would be that, Spain says, all right, let's see if really there's a majority of people who want to have their own country. Why can't we vote on it? Why can't we have a lengthy educational process saying, all right, well, what is it that you want, and what is it that you don't have, and how would it be different, and not the fear campaign, for example, that they had in Scotland, where they said, watch out, because if you become an independent country, you're not going to be a part of the EU. And look what happened.
Yeah, totally. You don't get it anyway.
You don't get it anyway. So this idea that you should be able to have this educational campaign, really have a fair vote, and then people should be able to decide. That's the best way to figure out who should govern.
I hate to give anyone who's on the opposing side ideas, but the thing that I will say, listening to both you and Ben and Bujar, this is going to be a pivot to you. This is going to be a brilliant thing. It's going to pivot right to you, the whole thing. But what we do in America, and we are master vote suppressors in America, is we wouldn't hold out on having the referendum or the vote. We would just have 30 of them, and each of them would be confusing as to exactly what they were. This is what we do, especially in Texas, right? There's always an election, and it's always about something, and there's always advertising behind it. And so you just, number one, you get tired, you get confused, and then you don't have this sort of high stakes drama game that I don't see them winning in the end, right? I think in the UK, especially, you see sort of Cameron just being like, what are the chances any of this stuff happens? Let's just go for it. And it's when you don't have the imagination to think of these things is when it happens. But Bujar, you certainly have plenty of elections in Kosovo, and none of them seem to stick. But of course, this last one for the self-determination movement was the most overwhelming victory of any party, etc. in Kosovo. Do you see this as the desire, as sort of the same thing as an independence movement, just sort of people looking to consolidate their actual self-determination, not in a purely political way, but in a movement way? Do you know what I mean? Like, it's sort of more in popular power than in legal power, because as we know, that's a very fragile thing in a young nation like Kosovo.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wanted to connect first to what Liz said, because actually not a lot of people know this, but in 1991 Kosovo had a referendum and declared independence, and that was not respected by anyone. It was recognized only by Albania. And what I want to say is that the referendums, they have to have a just basis, right? And people have to have this kind of feeling that they are this sort of imagined community and they belong together, as Liz was saying, and so on and so on. And in the case of Kosovo, I think that it is indisputable that that kind of just basis was there, because and this is in a way kind of the absurdity of the issue now in terms of Serbia not recognizing Kosovo, because how can you burn down a country, plunder it, commit genocide, and do all these things, and then in the end say, I don't recognize you? So what is the alternative? What is the kind of other way? I mean, this is like saying, Poland should be again part of Germany. It's absolutely absurd, in terms of the basis for why people in Kosovo want to claim self-determination. Now, to get to your question, I think that yes, I think that the broad appeal of Vetëvendosje was also because of the failure of the past governments. So the failure of the past governments to really kind of stand as kind of Kosovo, right? To kind of self-recognize themselves, I would say, like in that way. Because it was always, of course, that the talk was Kosovo is independent and so on, but it was always concessions. And Kosovo was not gaining anything. And I think that this is the reason why people voted for Vetëvendosje, because they have a hope that they will change something. And this is a very big majority, and so maybe we have some leverage there, right? So we in the past it was always like fractions, this party has 10%, that party has 12%. And in the end, they could never do nothing. And none of the governments could stick also for very long. And so now there's a hope that there's going to be some change. There are some problems, of course, that now with the pandemic, for example, this is not something very easy to overcome, especially for a country like Kosovo, which is very poor, has limited resources. But yeah, I think that the momentum is good for Vetëvendosje. And the work that they do remains to be seen, right? This is something that we cannot judge from now, and I'm personally very hesitant.
No, I know. Even more hesitant with my question here, but it's a quick lightning round, just to end up, which is, and then wait until I finish asking everyone. But is Ben, will there be a second referendum, and when? Liz, will there be, additional movements, and when? And Bujar, should we anticipate movement in the recognition of Kosovo internationally based on these other places maybe having successful things? So go quick. Ben, you first.
I think there will be, but I think it'll be in a few years because actually I don't think either side really wants to have a referendum right away. The pro-independence side hasn't quite sorted out exactly what it's going to say in terms of what an independent Scotland will look like.
Yeah.
And although it suits them politically to say they want a referendum now, they're probably not ready for it. And meanwhile, the UK side wants to put it off for as long as possible. But I think eventually there has to be another kind of democratic legitimation of the union or the dissolution of it, because there's now such a kind of passionately held and extensive critique of the union within Scotland that I don't think it's sustainable to keep that going for longer than a few years. So I think there will be, but the kind of micro politics of how you get to having another one is quite complicated and might take quite a few years to work out.
Liz.
So I want to stress that part of the issue is about alliances, but there's a big piece that's economic and about power. And Spain really, really, really doesn't want to let go 20% of its in taxes, and which is Catalonia. And so that would be very, very difficult for them to allow us to have a vote. But will it go away? No, of course not. Not at all. In the last elections, 52% of the people in Catalonia voted for pro-independence parties. That's a majority. It's not a huge majority, but it's a majority. And those people aren't going away. And we still have our political leaders in jail for holding a referendum. So that's another motor that keeps people moving and say, you can't just turn away and say, oh, well, sorry, we lost. No, because you can't leave those people in jail unjustly. So there's a slogan that says, we'll do it again, and we will do it again as many times as it takes to get the representation that we believe that every human deserves in a democratic system. How long it will take to happen is anybody's guess. Right now, the Catalans are famous for infighting, and right now that's pretty bad time in terms of that. Right after these elections, they haven't been able to form a coalition government, and everybody's pointing fingers at everybody else.
I think our listeners will have noticed you said independence parties and not independence party, which certainly puts a lot of clarity on the Scottish situation.
Right,
there's a party identified singularly with the movement.
Sure. No, there's three, which is an interesting thing, because then there's sort of a center-right party, a center-center party, and a center-left, and a more left party, which kind of shows the representation it has throughout society. And it's also true that younger people are much more pro-independence than very old people, or people who suffered during the dictatorship, who might be worried about fighting for independence because who knows what will happen. So I think that with time, it's inevitable that we will eventually become independent. How it will happen, I'm not sure, but I know that people aren't just going to give up.
And Bujar, last word. It's not easy. You can be independent, but not really be independent.
No, but as Liz was saying again, I mean, these things that don't go away just because you put them under the carpet. And I mean, there was a big attempt in the, let's say, to assimilate the Catalan language, but it's still there, right? It's flourishing now. And I think this is the same issue with Kosovo. With regard to the recognition, I don't see personally how the big players, let's say Russia or China, are going to move very soon in recognizing Kosovo. That would make like a major change. Like any of the members of the UN Security Council would recognize Kosovo, and that could inspire other countries to recognize Kosovo, because right now we have like a kind of pretty clear-cut way in the countries which have recognized Kosovo, and versus the countries that did not recognize Kosovo. And that is one thing. And the other thing is that Serbia is actively working for the de-recognition of Kosovo. So they're going to countries in Africa which recognized Kosovo, for example, and corrupting officials, giving them a lot of money.
And actually flipping them.
Exactly, flipping them, to de-recognize us. And so this is the kind of limited capacity that we have as a 2 million, as a 1.7 or 8 million country with very limited resources and very limited diplomatic power also. And so that's why we need alliances, and that's why we need to rely on like powerful countries like the United States and Germany to actually help us in this process. But any kind of small gain, you know, sometimes you have this news and, you know, some small island somewhere in the Caribbean recognized Kosovo and so on. Any sort of small news like this is good because it reaffirms that, you know, it can go on. And so I don't know also how much longer it's gonna go. But the only problem is that the damage that is being done to the people of Kosovo is tremendous. People not being able to move freely, all sort of bureaucratic, you know, complications that they have, and so on and so on. So this is a whole generation which is lost because of this sort of difficulties.
Thank you so much, Bujar. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Ben. And we'll all have all of you back to get in deeper on this stuff. And thank you all for joining us. And next week, we're going to be digging in deeper on the communications behind the climate debate, a war we seem to be losing. Thank you.
Ciao.
La imagen por la cual vale la pena arriesgar la vida, sacrificarse hasta la muerte.
You don't like art school things.
I don't like art school things. I don't like art school people. I went and visited an art school once, and everyone was very pretentious, obnoxious.
You not wanting me to do vocal warm-ups to me doesn't seem totally fair because that's part of my craft. And just
I don't care if you do vocal warm-ups, but let me just tell you something.
Well, I'm just saying the comments with like an art school, you know, like
you're in Berlin, so I don't think I would know about the vocal warm-ups unless you were projecting them at me through film or through text or just recordings. It's like I always have to be
on my own.
Yeah.
This is how I don't like people who exercise
Why don't
publicly.
You do...
Oh my God, I'm having like a total moment of like self-realization. So that's the same thing as like exercising in public. I'm like jogging. So if I'm doing mommy made me match my M&Ms, I'm actually like jogging in public.
It's much worse, honestly. I'd rather see you jog.
It's not worse.
And I don't want to see you jog at all.
Our studies helped us to understand the importance of birth control, and we were the first to practice it. Then we formed this group to get the information around to everyone else. We try to stress the importance of birth control in our family planning program. We give out information concerning the use of contraceptives, for example, the IUD and the pill, and also about abortions in some cases. Our main reason for family planning is not overpopulation. We practice it to maintain the health of the mother and child and to fully liberate women. Having a lot of children is not prohibited. Is the pill free? Yes, it's distributed free by the state. Are abortions available? Yes, but only if requested. We don't recommend it. Is it free? Yes. In the past, young people got married at 21 or 22. Nowadays, we encourage them to get married later. They marry at about 26 or 25. The old people think that the sooner their children marry, the sooner their grandchildren will help support the family. Anyone who thinks like that is in a hurry to get married. But young people should take advantage of their freedom to study and contribute to the great revolutionary movement. Marriage and children are a heavy burden, so we need to promote the concepts of birth control and late marriage.
Hey, welcome back. Good to see everyone still here. And we have a really special segment now. We're going to be talking to Philip Proudfoot, who is the founder of the Northern Independence Party. You may not be familiar with them because they are very new on the scene, but actually were founded and contested an election in very short order in the UK, and we'll be talking to him about that. Thank you, Philip, for coming on. And it's perfect because, as I think was just telling you, we had a long conversation with some folks from Scotland and Catalonia and Kosovo about self-determination, and that's at the heart of your project. Can we just start by you telling me just a little bit about the foundation of the Northern Independence Party? I would say just up front, like people who are impressed with the effort would call it like, you know, the beginning of a new democratic process, and folks who aren't would be like some sort of meme Twitter thing that's gotten out of control. Tell us the actual origin story, since it is you.
Yeah, the meme Twitter thing is funny because it was that at the start, but now we have, you know, things like ratified standing orders. So I think we're like the first meme shitpost party that has an entire web of bureaucratic infrastructure emerging behind it to try and control it. But yeah, we did start partially as a joke, I suppose, but like all good jokes tell you something real. And the reason it founded on the basis of there was a moment in Britain when the approach to lockdown during COVID was to implement like different degrees of lockdown around the country, and the North was kept in lockdown for longer, and Andy Burnham, the mayor of Manchester, because the infection rates were high in the North, and that's for complicated reasons, but Andy Burnham requested additional support, and then central government, which had been guaranteeing an 80% cover on people's lost wages, offered Manchester 67. And it was kind of the most like visceral, in-your-face demonstration of this like deep structural inequality in the UK, which we call the North-South divide. And then, however you look at it, sort of statistically, in terms of health, education, take any statistic you look at, you'll see that the North is in a different kind of relationship to the Southeast. And it's not, I mean, we find similar phenomena like that across the world, where the capital cities and those areas surrounding it gain more access to sort of wealth, power and privilege. But people don't quite realize, I think, just like how exceptional the UK is in terms of that, in terms of just how much money and investments goes into one tiny corner of the country, and how everywhere else is left to either decline or the population is expected to move away. And the thing about COVID is that it really revealed, like the Secretary General of the UN said that COVID's like an X-ray, reveals the fractures in every society. Well, our fracture is the North-South divide. So we started as like this Twitter page responding to that as a kind of joke. But then I put up I was like, okay, it's gained traction really quickly because this is a sentiment, this is a material reality in the UK that people can connect to. So the moment we put up this Twitter page, suddenly we started getting more and more followers. So then I put up a sign-up form, started a WhatsApp group. The WhatsApp group turned into a Slack office. That then turned into a combined Discord and Slack headquarters. And then suddenly we're getting, we've got thousands of members now. We have a strong income stream. We've contested elections. It may have started kind of a bit joking around with Andy Burnham, King of the North, taking on London, these kinds of sentiments. But it also has become a serious thing. And also, we call the country we want to build Northumbria because the United Kingdom itself isn't an entity that has existed all through history. There was the last time the North was a self-governing polity, it was called the Kingdom of Northumbria, which people don't realise means north of the Humber. The Humber is a sort of a river that comes in marks the beginning of the North, and then all those territories north of that were a separate kingdom. I mean, we don't want a kingdom, we just like the name, so we call it Northumbria. Yeah. But it's real, it's a joke, it's multiple things at the same time, but it is a political party now, so as well.
I mean, one of these things that is through line that we were talking about on that previous panel was that in the 21st century, a lot of these kind of independence projects are a reaction towards wanting to set up a social democratic project in the face of neoliberal opposition.
Yeah.
You know, one could even almost call it neo-colonial when you have something like the UK, which is, of course, a project of empire kind of at its heart. Do you see similarities in what you are doing and, say, with the SNP, where, again, it really is kind of a quest for social democracy, you know, more than some kind of ancient, intractable, fight on the island?
So I have a particular position on the sort of colonial question. The North is not colonized. It was not colonized. It was part of British Empire. The North, while it is the most impoverished part of the UK, it nonetheless benefited from a history of colonial relations around the rest of the world. So the North, for instance,
I mean, shipping was going to
like weapons manufacturing. The biggest employer in the Northeast was a weapons manufacturing. So the North was embedded within those broader colonial relations. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the kinds of economic forms of exploitation that existed in the North were not things that were then exported out in a hyper form to Britain's colonial possessions. But the North was embedded within colonialism. But that doesn't mean that breaking up the UK is not a good project for destroying the legacies of colonialism. Ending the UK as a union itself is actually a relatively progressive project in the same way that we see in Scotland. And I mean, like obviously when you compare the North or Northumbria to Scotland, the similar sort of relationship with Westminster is clear to all. So, for instance, the North would never have ever had, if it was an independent political project, a Tory government. Even in 2019, when people talk about this defeat, I mean, first of all, they've bought the Tory propaganda line, which is that the Red Wall has collapsed. Well, actually, a few seats in the Northeast collapsed, and it would still, if it was an independent country, have produced a progressive democratic socialist government. So we have the same, and the same is true for Scotland. Like, Scotland has basically the times in which we've been represented by the government we voted for since the birth of democracy in the UK is about 30% of the time. And it does not seem like anyone in Westminster is keen on transforming the electoral system. So the same kind of like arguments around how do we actually build democratic socialism in the UK has to move on with Scotland and Wales to viewing that the biggest enemy to democratic socialism is the UK itself as a political entity. It's designed to prevent not even wild democratic socialism, just something a bit better than what we have now is not possible within the union. So it is part of that. We do connect with that kind of progressive part of the SNP.
I mean, I think to some folks who even think of a United Confederation that is the geopolitical entity that the UK encompasses, would maybe even be improved by making England a bit smaller. That it's sort of a bit of a too big of a gorilla to play well with other entities. So I mean, one could almost argue that some kind of project like this could also restore a confederated union of folks by making something more stable. But let me ask you, I guess, maybe the trickiest question, which is now, and as a person who, is not reporting on this, but does campaigns for a living, like the easy fruit, the low-hanging fruit has been gathered. The people who are sort of very ripe and a little sour on labor, who are really ready to hear you, between 6 and 10%, even some places, which is quite a lot, is great. As you know, every percentage you go higher than that becomes harder and harder to get. What are the things you're going to do to try to get more people to become a sustained, viable party that's actually competing to win places? And it must be, and sorry to feed the answer to the question, but it must be more than just getting disaffected labor folks, because otherwise you're both just trying to park in the same parking spot. And it maybe does allow others to slip through more easily. Like, how do you make kind of a holistic appeal to all kinds of you tell me.
Well, I think that we really haven't captured all of those Labour folks, actually, because if you look at the local elections, most people who would have voted Labour, we haven't got the full analysis yet, but they seem to have stayed home and not voted for us. Some might have voted for the Greens. So that I think there's still actually quite a huge proportion of people that we will ultimately begin to appeal to. We also hope to, obviously it's very early days, we're 6 months old, but like one of the segments of the population we can directly appeal to are those who bought into, and it's complicated, but bought into the kind of Brexit type agenda.
Mhm.
So those people who feel that their towns have been left behind and that they blame the European Union for that. When I say that, I'm not pretending that the European Union is some sort of like an actor, a benevolent actor that isn't involved in that process whatsoever. But nonetheless, that sentiment of wanting to take back control, that great slogan, you know, like that would connect to a lot of people who hope to see positive change in these like left behind regions of the UK. And on that front, you know, like the reason why we think we can appeal to them through independence is that in the history of sort of an attempt to devolve powers in the UK, in 2004 there was a referendum in the northeast. Northeast is the poorest part of England, it's where I'm from. There was an attempt to establish an assembly, kind of what they have in Wales, but even less power. The man who led that campaign to stop that happening, 80% of people voted against it. The man who led that campaign, do you know who he was? Do you know who he is? Dominic Cummings. Dominic Cummings led the anti-Northeast referendum campaign, and he led it on a platform we'd agree with, and a platform that we think would sweep up those kind of like very angry people.
Yeah, he's no dummy, right?
He's not like, his campaign was, this is an expensive talking shop. The people don't want more. They don't want more politicians. They want power. And the sort of argument for devolution is always going to end up being framed through, oh, well, here's some more expensive politicians. Here's another layer of representatives between you and the people who actually control power, control finances, control the treasury. Just more talking until you actually get to it. So independence as a claim is saying, no, actually what we're going to do is we're going to put power right in the heart of the North, and then we'll take back control of our own. So you can see there's that appeal there, and what you're doing, which is so if you look at what Labour did in terms of their campaign, it was to have Keir Starmer stand in front of a flag and hold a pint and kind of nod and wink to that sort of reactionary nationalism in the North. What we're doing is we're trying to take that and point it in what we would see as the right direction, which is a particular economic model that has allowed for the depopulation of these small towns, has destroyed our communities, has forced all of our young people to move away. It's not the blame for that does not fall on migrants. It does not fall on all these other places in which the Tories would want to position that blame. It falls on the Westminster system and trying to point that anger towards a correct form of analysis. And doing so, we could sweep up that 10-15% of voters. Disaffected voters, we're going to work at appealing to them as well through the sort of like bold proposal to do something radically different, and we're going to really focus on like building local candidates going forward. Like we've got a candidate academy. We're identifying people within the party who sit in like potential marginal seats. And then we even have Tories. We even have former Tories now joining the Northern Independence Party. And they join as well on the basis of the North-South divide. Our biggest problem is that because of the North-South divide, people who have the time and capacity to engage in politics, they tend to live in the Southeast because they're not working in like crap jobs in the North, and they have like a bit of time free, and they're not exhausted through like various forms of like, manufacturing is still relatively high in the North as a form of labour. So we actually need to find a way in which people in the South can support our movement while not being members if they don't feel it's for them, even though we are trying to build a radically different country in the same way that Scotland is, that would be welcoming and whatever. So, you can see there are actually all these broad coalitions that we're trying to figure out how to bring in, but it's a work in progress. We're brand new.
And to me, yes, you're brand new, and obviously, you're exhausted coming off of, 6 months followed by an election this week. But what, as you're looking forward, as you're recruiting candidates, and as you're thinking about messaging, what seems to me the broadest challenge you have, especially in the coalitions you're talking about building, is the fact that Labour, others, many others, I don't even want to single out labor there, have cynically kind of confused white nationalism with working class pride for decades and decades. And this seems to me to be a big problem because I have not been as far traveled in the Northeast, certainly a place you're from, but in the 2019 elections, I was in the Midlands a lot. I was talking to people in places like Wolverhampton. I do have some idea of the kind of, when you get out of London, what people are feeling. But the most effective organizers I saw were definitely people in the pockets of communities of color, especially. This is where real organizing that was effective was happening. So you want to make sure, even tactically, as you're putting together a coalition, to make sure that those folks feel welcome coming in. How are you balancing that out? And it's a problem that you're inheriting. Again, that's decades old. So if you don't have a brilliant answer right off the cuff, do not feel bad.
Well, we're directly confrontational with that. Like, nothing, one of the reasons we set up the party is that structural economic thing. But for me, like, that issue around whatever we want to call it, identity, culture, the way in which we've been, like, portrayed as sort of like people from the North are sort of reactionary bigots, that upsets me. I'm trying to not use harsh language here a great deal. And I often talk about this, right? When I was growing up, right, in my granddad lives in a small left behind town in northeast Durham, in northwest Durham. There is a house there near his house where they would fly a big Union flag, and we were told as children, don't go and play there. They're weirdos, because they were like BNP members. These were like the outriders. And if you look even at the history of sort of reactionary politics in the UK, it's very difficult to identify a sort of right-wing, fascist, racist leader who emerged in the north of England. What tends to happen is they're from the southeast. I'm not saying that this is an essential thing. I'm just talking about what we see historically. Mm-hmm. And then they attempt to take the north.
No, it's important because there is the narrative versus reality, and one has taken over.
Is that we're the bigots, and we produce these like sort of racists who then are, but then Nigel Farage, where's he from, right? Where's Tommy Robinson from? Where's like Nick Griffin from? Where's like Oswald Mosley from? Point to me one leader of sort of British fascism who is from the north, other than they try and take the north. And everyone knows about like the Battle of Cable Street, but there are also lots and lots of battles like that in the history in the north where we pushed back fascism as well. But because the real reason why that sort of the problem is that these northern safari journalists, they go to Wetherspoons in the middle of the day in the north, and they find a drunk who's saying something ridiculous. They'll get that ridiculous shot. Totally. Of that drunk saying something. And I would wager, even with that drunk guy, if you kept with him and you kept talking, you would actually find that what's informing that like ridiculous racist position he says is not some like deep-seated like commitment to fascism. It's largely just a misdirection of his anger that's a product of all sorts of sort of media educational like manipulation that can be like, it's just deeply frustrating to have that sort of the way in which the North is represented. And like, under Corbyn's problem was that those sentiments were left to grow. They were not directly tackled. They were sort of like pushed aside. There were those moments where like, there were those videos put out where Corbyn was saying like some guy was blaming migrants, and then like there's a guy like telling him, no, don't blame migrants, right? Okay, fine. There's that stuff. But then under the Tories are perfectly happy to just play with it, exaggerate it, use it to build their electoral power. And now Keir Starmer is doing like basically the same thing. And I think it has to be tackled head on. And one of the ways in which you do that is like some of our projects. We'll be starting our own podcast. We're going to try and have our own media where we talk about the history of like anti-fascism in the North. Because I could go on and on about this, but if you think about it's a product of the North-South divide. So like most activism and organizing and things like that tends to be done in the Southeast anyway. So we're already not front and center of the conversation. So then if you look at things like, the Windrush scandal, it kind of gets a London-centric take on it, when actually huge elements of the Windrush community were in Liverpool. And like Liverpool kind of gets forgotten in all of these narratives itself, and kind of seen as an outsider. And then there's just so much work that can be done to try and reverse this representation of the North that is inaccurate. I mean, one of the things, for Ramadan, we put out, our Ramadan message had an image of South Shields Yemeni community that's lived in Yemen, that's lived in South Shields for hundreds of years, and people don't know about like this like idea that is a monolithic white bloc, when actually we have these communities that have lived for hundreds of years in South Shields. I mean, this is another example of this. There's a Roman fort in the northeast called Arabeum, I think, and the reason is that the soldiers stationed there were from Mesopotamia. So the North has been international since. I mean, they were soldiers stationed in the northeast, okay, but still, nonetheless, it's been international for centuries. But nonetheless, it gets portrayed, and it really is a huge annoyance for me, and one of the reasons why I started it is also coming up against that same idea among people who I would expect to be comrades in London, thinking, oh, the North, they all voted Brexit, they're all bigots, London has the monopoly over diversity, London is it's a sore spot.
So what are next steps in terms of elections, kind of that you all want to contest, to make sure that these narratives get cemented? What's going on? What's up?
So we are likely at the moment now going to focus really hard on like building the party, because we were rushed so quickly into that election that we approached that election basically as using the by-election as a megaphone, and we increased our membership by several thousand thanks to that by-election, and that was basically the intention, was to use it as a means to gain even more media representation. So we got lots and lots of articles in The Guardian, in the New Statesman, to try and pick up those members who you mentioned earlier, disaffected Labour supporters, because while a lot of our membership are people who've never been engaged in politics, some of them are disaffected Labour members, and we deliberately try to pick them up because they're incredibly talented activists, etc. So now we have that membership, we have those resources. We're now going to try and basically really focus on building the organisation, building the different units, research units, the campaigns unit. We also, as we're now moving out of lockdown, a lot of people say, why aren't you? You're all online. You don't do community organising. I mean, for God's sake, we've been in a pandemic where we can't really do that. Ethically, we don't have liabilities insurance. We didn't have liabilities insurance. Now we have an infrastructure in place where we can actually start doing community organising, and that's the next step. Basically, is that we're going to do everything that the Labour Party should be doing. Is basically the plan. So if you look at somewhere like Hartlepool, there was that vicar who runs a food bank who spoke out against Keir Starmer. Mm-hmm. In no world should a vicar who's running a food bank be feeling disconnected from the Labour Party. The Labour Party should be like front and centre, maximising those voices. They should be funneling volunteers into these initiatives. This is like core parts of like what it means to be, I think, like a democratic socialist in your everyday life. So we're going to then start moving into not making up we're not going to, all these initiatives exist. We're just going to help funnel our activists to start doing like immediate practical solidarity.
I think being helpful with social services is one of the big components that's missing in kind of modern socialism.
Yeah. And like I had a debate, right, with a new Northern Tory for Barrow-in-Furness, and the Conservative Party in the UK is starting to adopt the tactics of community organising, community wealth building, and then Labour are just doing like focus groups, flags and pints. So it's just like, when you say, again, talking about who we're going to pick up, Labour will continue to shed members and shed votes. Like, it's just I can't get my head around what they're doing. So yeah, the next steps are basically we want to become a force in the community now that we're out of lockdown. Obviously, we weren't doing that during lockdown. And a lot of the problems we faced are to do with the fact we were an online movement by necessity. So yeah, those are the next steps, basically.
Cool. And when you all have your leadership elections to sort of formally democratically enshrine the process, we would love to check in, just because I think it's interesting watching a party kind of come to grips with its democratic processes. We were talking last week about Cinque Stelle, which is sort of one of the first people to kind of toy around with these at least online ideas of coming together. But Philip, thank you so much for coming on and explaining to us what's going on in the North, and we appreciate you.
Thank you for inviting me.
You need time to change your ideas, especially when you're old. It's hard to adapt to new ideas, but that's only natural. It's not that old ideas no longer exist. They haven't been completely eliminated. They still exist, in some people more than others. You can't get rid of them all at once, but they're starting to disappear. The difference is really striking. Do you think you still have some of the old ideas? I'm no exception. I also had self-centered individualistic ideas, sometimes very selfish ones. I learned from the Cultural Revolution, and the New Brigade leaders were a good example of how to be less selfish. So my ideas are changing, little by little. Do you think there will be other cultural revolutions? A new revolution. After the Cultural Revolution, Chairman Mao warned us that there would be new political struggles, that they would be unavoidable. But personally, I don't understand the meaning of his words. I don't see how this revolution will come about.
Hey, thanks for sticking with us. As we were putting the show together, our own Julia Doubleday was talking about how it reminded her a bit of the beginning of Wretched of the Earth, and knowing it was one of my favorite books, she suggested we do it as tonight's reading, and so I'd like to make it so, and read to you from Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. So the chapter on violence. The colonial world is a world cut in two. The dividing line, the frontiers, are shown by barracks and police stations. In colonies, it is the policeman and the soldier who are the official, instituted go-betweens, the spokesman of the settler and his rule of oppression. In capitalist societies, the educational system, whether lay or clerical, the structures of moral reflexes handed down from father to son, the exemplary honesty of workers who are giving a medal after 50 years of good and loyal service, and the affection which springs from harmonious relations and good behavior, all these aesthetic expressions of respect for the established order serve to create around the exploited person an atmosphere of submission and the multitude of moral teachers, counselors, and bewilderers. They separate the exploited from those in power. In colonial countries, on the contrary, the policeman and the soldier, by their immediate presence and their frequent and direct action, maintain contact with the native and advise him by means of rifle butts and napalm not to budge. It is obvious here that the agents of government speak the language of pure force. The intermediary does not lighten the oppression, nor seek to hide the domination. He shows them and puts them into practice. He shows them up and puts them into practice with clear conscience of an upholder of the peace. Yet he is the bringer of violence into the home and into the mind of the native. The zone where the natives lie is not complementary to the zone inhabited by the settlers. The two zones are opposed, but not in the service of a higher unity. Obedient to the rules of pure Aristotelian logic, they both follow the principle of reciprocal exclusivity. Woof, tonight is rough. No conciliation is possible for the two items. One is superfluous. The settler's town is strongly built, all made of stone and steel. It is a brightly lit town. The streets are covered with asphalt, and the garbage cans swallow all the leavings, unseen, unknown, and hardly even thought about. The settlers' feet are never visible, except perhaps in the sea. But there you're never close to see them. His feet are protected by strong shoes, although the streets of his town are clean and even with no holes or stones. The settler's town is a well-fed town, an easygoing town. Its belly is always full of good things. The settler's town is a town full of white people, of foreigners. The town belonging to the colonized people, or at least the native town, the Negro village, the Medina, the reservation, is a place of ill fame, peopled by men of evil repute. They are born there, it matters little where or how, and they die there, it matters not where nor how. It is a world without spaciousness. Men live there on top of each other, and their huts are built one on top of one another, one on top of the other. The native town is a hungry town, starved of bread, of meat, of shoes, of coal, of light. The native town is a crouching village, a town on its knees, a town wallowing in the mire. The look of the native's turn on the settler's town is a look of lust, a look of envy. It expresses his dreams of possession, all manner possession, to sit at the settler's table, to sleep in the settler's bed, with his wife if possible. The colonized man is an envious man, and the settler knows very well. When their glances meet, he ascertains bitterly, always on the defensive, they want to take our place. It is true, for there is no native who does not dream at least once a day of settling himself up in a settler's place, of setting himself up in the settler's place. This world is divided into compartments. This world is inhabited by two different species. The originality of the colonial context is that economic reality, inequality, and the immense difference of ways of life never come back to mask the human realities. When you examine the close quarters in the colonial context, it is evident that what parcels out the world to begin with, the fact of belonging or not belonging to a given race, a given species. In the colonies, the economic substructure is also a subculture. The cause is the consequence. You are rich because you are white because you are rich. This is why Marxist analysis should always be slightly stretched every time we have to do it with the colonial problem. So let's keep slightly stretching, see where we get. Thanks so much. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, Golda. And we'll see you next time. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And if you want to subscribe to support the committee program with Arun Chaudhary, please go to fans.fm/committee and learn how you can become a paying subscriber and get extra content.